boring history for sleep. What it was like to live as a medieval outlaw. The dense forest of Sherwood stretched endlessly under the grey English sky, a vast sea of oak and elm that had stood since time immemorial. Beneath its ancient canopy, where shafts of weakened sunlight barely penetrated the thick foliage, a man named Thorn rested his weary back against the rough bark of an oak tree. His calloused hands methodically sharpened a small hunting knife against a smooth riverstone, a repetitive motion he had performed countless times before. The rhythmic scraping sound blended with the ambient noises of the forest, the distant call of birds, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, the occasional snap of a twig as small creatures moved about their business. This was his life now, measured in such simple moments, far from the village where he had once been known as Thomas Miller, son of the local baker, a man of modest means but respected standing. The year was 1214, and King John's England was a land of stark contrasts. While nobles feasted in their stone keeps and manor houses, common folk toiled endlessly, bound to the land and to their lords by ancient custom and unyielding law. Thorn had never given much thought to the politics of the realm before his troubles began. He had been content with his humble existence, working alongside his father in the bakery, occasionally courting Mary, the miller's daughter, and paying his taxes when the Lord Steward came collecting. It was a simple life, predictable and secure in its own way, despite the hardships that all commoners faced. That life had ended 3 years ago, on a cold autumn morning when Sir Geoffrey, the local lord's son, had found his prized hunting falcon dead near the village boundary. In his rage, he had accused Thomas of the deed, claiming he had seen the baker's son near the spot the previous evening. It mattered little that Thomas had been helping his ailing father that entire day and had not left the bakery. Sir Geoffrey's word was law in the village, and no amount of protestation could save Thomas from the Lord's justice. The penalty for killing a nobleman's prized hunting bird was severe, the loss of a hand. As Thomas was dragged to the village square, where the travelling executioner was preparing his tools, a cold realization washed over him. This was not justice. This was the arbitrary cruelty of power unchecked. In that moment of clarity, as the guards momentarily loosened their grip while arguing over the proper procedure, Thomas had slipped away, running blindly into the forest that bordered the village. That had been the beginning of his life as Thorn, the name he had adopted to separate himself from the man he had been. It was a common enough practice among those who lived outside the law, to take a new name, to forge a new identity, to leave behind the remnants of a previous existence. Some chose names of strength or cunning, wolf, swift or shadow. Thomas had chosen Thorn, for he had decided that day that he would be a thorn in the side of those who abused their power. The first months had been the hardest. Winter was approaching, and Thomas had little knowledge of how to survive in the wild. He had grown up in a village, surrounded by the rhythms of agricultural life and the safety of walls and neighbors. The forest was an alien place, filled with unseen dangers and unfamiliar challenges. He had nearly died that first winter, huddled in a hastily constructed shelter of branches and leaves, subsisting on whatever meager food he could forage or steal from nearby farmsteads. Thorn set down his knife and stone, satisfied with the edge he had honed. He reached for a small pouch at his belt, withdrawing a strip of dried venison. As he chewed the tough meat, his mind wandered back to those early days. He had been so naive then, so unprepared for the reality of living as an outlaw. The romantic tales of forest bandits that minstrels sang in village taverns bore little resemblance to the grinding hardship of his daily existence. Food was a constant concern. In summer and autumn, the forest provided berries, nuts, and roots that could sustain a knowledgeable forager. Game was plentiful for those who knew how to hunt, rabbits, squirrels, and occasionally deer, though taking the king's deer was a hanging offense. But winter transformed the forest into a barren place, where starvation lurked behind every tree. Thorn had learned to smoke and preserve meat when it was available, to recognize which roots could be dug from frozen ground, and to steal with caution and restraint from isolated farms and travelers. Shelter, too, was a challenge that evolved with the seasons. In the warmer months, a simple lean-to of branches covered with leaves sufficed to keep off the rain. But winter demanded more substantial protection from the cold and snow. Thorn had eventually discovered an abandoned charcoal burner's hut deep in the forest, its previous occupant likely claimed by illness or accident. He had repaired its sagging roof and walls, creating a crude but effective refuge that he returned to when the weather turned harsh. Perhaps the greatest hardship, though, was loneliness. Humans are social creatures, evolved to live in groups, to share labor and conversation, to find meaning in the connections they forge with others. Thorn's isolation weighed on him more heavily than hunger or cold ever could. Days would pass without him speaking a word aloud, until the sound of his own voice became strange to his ears. He would sometimes talk to the birds or the trees, simply to remember what it felt like to form words with his mouth. It was this loneliness, more than any other factor, that eventually drove him to seek out others like himself. There were always outlaws in the Greenwood, men and women who had fled the harsh justice of manor courts, deserters from the king's armies, debtors escaping their creditors, heretics hiding from the church. Most lived solitary lives, avoiding contact even with their fellow fugitives, but some formed loose bands for mutual protection and companionship. Thorn rose from his resting place, stretching his lean, wiry frame. 3 years of hard living had transformed him from the soft-handed baker's son to a hardened survivor. His once clean face was now covered with a thick beard, streaked with premature grey despite his 30 years. His clothes were a patchwork of homespun, leather, and occasionally finer materials taken from unfortunate travelers. Around his neck hung a simple wooden cross, a reminder of the faith he still clung to despite his circumstances. He gathered his few possessions, the knife, a small hatchet, a waterskin, and a rough blanket, and began walking deeper into the forest. The meeting place was still a few hours' journey away, and he preferred to arrive before dusk. The band he had joined was small, just 5 individuals brought together by circumstance rather than choice, but they had formed a tentative community in the wilderness. As he walked, Thorn's mind drifted to his companions. There was Will, a former soldier who had deserted after the disastrous campaign in Normandy, unable to stomach the atrocities he had witnessed. Despite his gruff exterior, Will had a kind heart and had taught Thorn much about survival and combat. Then there was Elaine, a widow who had fled her village after being accused of witchcraft when her knowledge of healing herbs had aroused suspicion. Her skills had saved Thorn's life when he had fallen ill with fever the previous winter. Edwin was younger than the rest, barely 20, the son of a minor nobleman who had killed a man in a tavern brawl and fled rather than face his father's wrath. And finally, there was old Tom, a former serf who had run away from his lord's estate after a lifetime of back-breaking labor had left him too weak to meet his quota. None of them would have chosen this life, but they had adapted to it with varying degrees of success. The forest grew denser as Thorn continued his journey, the trees pressing closer together, the undergrowth becoming more tangled. Few travelers ventured this deep into Sherwood, which made it an ideal hiding place for those who wished to remain unseen. The royal foresters, charged with protecting the king's hunting grounds and apprehending poachers, rarely patrolled these remote areas, preferring to focus their efforts on the forest edges where villages bordered the woodland. Thorn moved with the quiet confidence of one who knows the land intimately. He could read the forest like a book, the bent twig that indicated a deer had passed recently, the patch of disturbed earth where a wild boar had rooted for food, the subtle signs that distinguished a game trail from a human path. These skills had kept him alive when so many others in his position had been captured or killed. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Thorn finally reached the clearing, that served as the band's current meeting place. It was a small, natural opening in the forest, near a clear stream that provided fresh water. At its center was a fire pit, surrounded by logs that served as crude benches. Will was already there, tending a small fire over which a brace of rabbits was roasting. The smell made Thorn's stomach growl, reminding him that he had eaten little that day. "You're late," Will remarked without looking up from the fire. "Thought maybe the sheriff's men had finally caught up with you." "Not yet," Thorn replied, dropping his pack near one of the logs. "Though I did see signs of riders on the north path. Fresh tracks, maybe from this morning." Will frowned, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Foresters? More likely merchants. The tracks were deep, horses carrying heavy loads. Still, I avoided the path and came through the thickets instead." Will nodded approvingly. Caution had kept them alive this long. Elaine's gathering herbs by the stream. Edwin went to check his snares. Old Tom's sleeping. His joints are paining him again with the damp weather. Thorn glanced toward a crude shelter of branches and canvas where he could see the old man's form huddled beneath a blanket. Tom's health had been declining steadily, his body worn down by years of hard labor, followed by the harsh conditions of outlaw life. Thorn worried about him as winter approached, unsure if the old man would survive another season of cold and privation. "Any word from the villages?" Thorn asked, turning back to Will. The former soldier rotated the rabbits on their spit before answering. "Aye. Edwin spoke with a peddler yesterday. Says Sir Geoffrey's holding court at Nottingham Castle for the next fortnight. The sheriff's doubled the reward for information leading to your capture." Thorn's jaw tightened. 3 years had passed, yet Sir Geoffrey's determination to see him hang had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger, fueled by the humiliation of failing to capture one lowly peasant. What had begun as a simple matter of a dead falcon had evolved into a personal vendetta. "He still believes I killed his bird," Thorn said flatly. Will shrugged. "Doesn't matter what he believes. You made him look a fool when you escaped, and nobles don't forgive such insults. Besides, he's taken a special interest in clearing the forest of outlaws lately. Word is, King John has promised additional lands to lords who can secure their territories." This was troubling news. Increased patrols meant greater risk, more difficulty in moving about the forest or approaching villages to trade or gather information. They would need to be even more cautious in the coming weeks. The sound of footsteps drew their attention as Elaine emerged from the trees, a basket of plants and roots cradled in her arms. She was a woman of middle years, her dark hair streaked with grey, her face lined but still bearing traces of the beauty she must have possessed in her youth. Her knowledge of the forest's bounty had been invaluable to the band, providing medicines and supplementing their diet with edible plants that others might overlook. "The coltsfoot is flowering early this year," she remarked as she approached the fire. "Could mean a harsh winter ahead." She set down her basket and nodded a greeting to Thorn. "You look tired. Have you been sleeping poorly again?" Thorn shook his head, though it was a lie. Sleep often eluded him, his nights disturbed by dreams of his former life, of Mary's face, of his father growing old without him. Sometimes he dreamed of capture and execution, waking in a cold sweat with the phantom sensation of a rope around his neck. Elaine didn't press the issue, but she rummaged in her basket and withdrew a small bundle of dried leaves. "Steep these in hot water before you sleep tonight. They'll quiet your mind." Thorn accepted the herbs with a nod of thanks. Elaine's remedies often helped, though nothing could fully dispel the underlying anxiety that had become his constant companion. The life of an outlaw was one of perpetual vigilance, of knowing that capture meant death and that every day of freedom was borrowed time. As the day faded into evening, Edwin returned with 2 more rabbits for the pot, and old Tom awoke from his nap to join them around the fire. They ate in relative silence, savoring the hot food, each lost in their own thoughts. It was only after the meal, as they sat watching the flames dance in the growing darkness, that conversation resumed. "I heard something interesting in the village," Edwin said, his youthful face illuminated by the firelight. There's talk of a charter the barons are forcing King John to sign, something that would limit his powers and establish rights for freemen. Will snorted derisively. Noble talk. Even if such a document exists, it won't change anything for the likes of us. The strong will still prey on the weak, whether they wear a crown or not. Perhaps, Thorn said thoughtfully. But the idea that even a king must answer to law rather than ruling by whim alone, there's power in that notion. Old Tom coughed, a rattling sound that concerned Thorn. Laws are just words written by men with swords to impose their will on men without swords, the old man said bitterly. I've lived 60 winters, and I've never seen justice favor the common folk. There was a murmur of agreement around the fire. Each of them had experienced the arbitrary nature of justice in medieval England, where a lord's word could condemn a peasant without evidence or recourse. It was why they were here, after all, outcasts in the greenwood, living on the margins of a society that had no place for them. Still, Elaine said softly, we must believe in something better, or what's the purpose of continuing to fight? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Thorn stared into the flames, pondering her words. What was he fighting for? Survival, certainly. Revenge against Sir Geoffrey, perhaps, but was there something more, some greater purpose that could give meaning to his outlawed existence? The conversation drifted to more practical matters. The need to stockpile food for winter, reports of increased patrols near the forest edge, plans for relocating their camp as a precaution. These were the daily concerns that occupied most of their waking thoughts, the constant calculations of risk and reward that defined life outside the law. As the night deepened and his companions prepared for sleep, Thorn volunteered to take the first watch. He sat alone by the dying fire, wrapped in his blanket against the autumn chill, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the forest. An owl hooted in the distance, hunting mice in the underbrush. The wind whispered through the leaves, creating a gentle susurration that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. In these quiet moments, Thorn often reflected on the path that had brought him here. He had not chosen to become an outlaw. The role had been thrust upon him by circumstance and injustice. Yet he could not deny that there was a certain freedom in his current life that had been absent in his village existence. Here in the greenwood, he answered to no lord, paid no taxes, bent his knee to no authority save that which he freely accepted. There was dignity in that, despite the hardships. But freedom came at a cost. He was cut off from human society, from the rhythms and rituals that gave structure and meaning to medieval life. No church bells marked the hours for him, no feast days or holy days punctuated the turning of the seasons. He would never marry or father children, never practice a trade or own property, never be buried in consecrated ground with proper rites to speed his soul to heaven. These were heavy losses, and in the dark watches of the night, he sometimes wondered if they were too high a price to pay. The night wore on, and Thorn's thoughts turned to more immediate concerns. The news of increased patrols worried him. Winter was approaching, when food would become scarce and tracks in snow could betray their presence. They had survived previous winters by careful planning and good fortune, but each year seemed to bring new challenges. Old Tom's failing health was particularly concerning. The old man needed better shelter and more regular meals than their nomadic existence could provide. Perhaps it was time to consider a more permanent settlement deeper in the forest. There were ruins of an old hunting lodge several days' journey to the north that might be repaired to provide more substantial shelter. The area was remote enough that they might remain undisturbed, yet close enough to small villages that they could still obtain necessary supplies. It would mean abandoning the familiar territory they had come to know so well, but adaptation was the key to survival. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Thorn gently woke Will for the next watch. He then settled onto his simple bedroll, tucked beneath the low branches of a spruce tree that offered some protection from dew and wind. Despite his exhaustion, sleep did not come easily. When it finally did claim him, his dreams were troubled. filled with pursuing shadows and the distant baying of hounds. Morning brought a thin, misty rain that dampened the forest and their spirits. Breakfast was a cold affair, leftover rabbit and hard bread obtained from a sympathetic miller at the forest edge. As they ate, they discussed the day's tasks. Food gathering was a priority, as always. Elaine needed certain plants that grew in a clearing to the east. Old Tom would remain at camp, working on repairs to their crude shelters while his arthritic hands allowed him some dexterity. Will, Edwin and Thorn would split up to hunt, check snares, and scout the forest boundaries for signs of patrols. Meet back here by midday, Will instructed, his military background evident in the way he naturally assumed leadership in tactical matters. If anyone's not returned by dusk, the rest of us move camp immediately. Remember the fallback location. They all nodded their understanding. These protocols had been established early in their association, a necessary precaution in their dangerous existence. If one was captured, they could not risk leading pursuers back to the others. It was a harsh calculus, but one they had all accepted. Thorn gathered his hunting gear, a self-made bow of yew wood, a quiver of arrows fletched with goose feathers, his knife, and a small sack for carrying game. He checked that his water skin was full, then nodded farewell to his companions before melting into the dripping forest. He moved northwest, away from the areas they had recently hunted, seeking fresh territory where game might be more plentiful. The rain made tracking difficult, washing away scent and obscuring subtle signs, but it also muffled his footsteps and made the forest creatures less wary. After an hour of patient stalking, he spotted a young buck drinking from a small stream, its head raised periodically to check for danger. Thorn slowly drew an arrow from his quiver, nocked it, and drew the bowstring back to his ear. The yew bough creaked slightly with the tension, but the sound was lost in the general patter of raindrops on leaves. He aimed carefully, conscious that this shot could mean the difference between a week of adequate meals and continued hunger. The arrow flew true, striking the deer just behind the shoulder. The animal bounded away, but Thorn knew from the shot and the blood trail that it would not go far. He followed the crimson droplets on leaves and ground, moving carefully to avoid losing the trail in the rain. As he had predicted, the buck had collapsed after less than 100 yards, already dead when he reached it. Thorn knelt beside the animal, murmuring a brief prayer of thanks, both to God and to the deer itself for the sustenance it would provide. He then set to work with his knife, field dressing the carcass with practiced efficiency. This was a significant kill, more meat than he could carry back to camp alone. He would need to return with help to transport the bulk of it. For now, he removed the choicest portions, the liver, heart, and some of the loin, wrapping them in the deer's own hide. The rest he hoisted into the lower branches of a tree, high enough to be safe from most predators until he could return. With his pack now heavy with fresh meat, Thorn began the journey back to camp. He moved more slowly now, both because of his burden and because he was entering less familiar territory. The rain had intensified, reducing visibility and making the forest floor treacherous with mud and hidden roots. It was in these conditions, his attention divided between his footing and his surroundings, that disaster nearly found him. The snap of a twig was his only warning, a sound so subtle it might have been dismissed as a natural occurrence of the forest. But Thorn's instincts, honed by years of vigilance, recognized it as something different. He froze in mid-step, every sense suddenly alert, scanning his surroundings with the intensity of prey that knows a predator is near. Through the curtain of rain, he caught a glimpse of movement, a patch of color that did not belong to the forest's palette of greens and browns, the distinctive Lincoln green of a royal forester's cloak. And where there was one forester, there were likely more. Thorn slowly lowered himself to a crouch, setting down his pack as gently as possible. The deer meat would have to be abandoned. It would only slow him and leave a scent trail for dogs to follow. He began to back away, moving from tree to tree for cover, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid creating noise. The The forester had not yet spotted him, but was moving in a pattern that suggested he was part of a coordinated search. This was not a routine patrol. They were hunting someone specifically. Whether it was Thorn himself or another outlaw was impossible to know, but the distinction hardly mattered. Discovery meant a hanging rope either way. A new sound reached his ears, the distant baying of hounds. The foresters had brought dogs, which complicated his escape immeasurably. Dogs could follow a scent trail even through rain, and they could move faster through the underbrush than any man. Thorn's options narrowed dramatically. He could not outrun them, and fighting was out of the question. Attacking a royal forester was a capital offense, and there were too many to overcome. His only hope lay in confusing the trail. Thorn changed direction, heading toward the stream he had crossed earlier. Water was one of the few things that could break a scent trail effectively. If he could reach the stream before the dogs picked up his scent, he might be able to follow the watercourse to safety. The sounds of pursuit grew louder as he moved, no longer bothering with silence, but focusing on speed. The hounds had found something, perhaps the abandoned deer carcass, and their excited baying told him they would soon be on his trail. Thorn ran now, heedless of the branches that whipped at his face and the treacherous footing that threatened to send him sprawling. The stream appeared ahead, a ribbon of silver cutting through the green gloom of the forest. Without hesitation, Thorn plunged into the cold water, gasping as it reached his waist. The current was stronger than he had anticipated, swollen by the recent rains, but he fought his way across to the opposite bank, then turned downstream, wading through the rushing water as quickly as he dared. He continued this way for several hundred yards, the icy water numbing his legs and stealing his breath. When he finally emerged onto the bank, stumbling with cold and fatigue, he chose a spot where the ground was rocky, leaving minimal tracks. From there, he forced himself into a jog, heading east toward a part of the forest where the undergrowth was particularly dense. The pursuit sounds faded behind him, but Thorn knew better than to assume he had escaped. The foresters were professionals, experienced in tracking fugitives through the woodland. The dogs might lose his scent temporarily at the stream, but they would cast about until they found where he had emerged. His only advantage was his intimate knowledge of this part of the forest and the determination that came from knowing the price of capture. Hours passed as Thorn continued his evasion, alternating between bursts of speed and periods of careful movement, designed to leave minimal sign of his passage. He crossed streams whenever possible, used fallen trees as bridges to avoid leaving footprints, and backtracked occasionally to create false trails. The rain, which had seemed an inconvenience earlier, now became his ally, helping to obscure his tracks and dampen his scent. By late afternoon, he had heard no sounds of pursuit for some time, but he dared not return to camp directly. The foresters might be watching the known outlaw gathering places, waiting for fugitives to return to their companions. Instead, Thorn made his way to one of the band's emergency caches, a hollow tree, where they kept spare weapons, flint and steel, and a small store of dried food for precisely such situations. Night was falling as he reached the cache, the forest growing increasingly dark beneath the overcast sky. Thorn retrieved a small bundle of provisions and a dry woolen cloak from the hollow, grateful for the foresight that had led them to establish these reserves. He would spend the night here, he decided, too exhausted to travel safely in darkness. In the morning, he would make his way to the fallback location, hoping to find his companions there. Huddled at the base of the ancient oak, wrapped in the slightly musty but dry cloak, Thorn ate a meager meal of dried venison and a handful of hazelnuts from the cache. His clothes were soaked, his body chilled to the bone, but he dared not risk a fire that might attract attention. Instead, he focused on controlling his shivering, on breathing deeply and steadily to generate what warmth he could. As he sat in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the forest and the continuing patter of rain on leaves, Thorn reflected on the precariousness of his existence, how quickly security could turn to danger, how thin the line between life and death in the greenwood. Today's close call was not the first, and it would certainly not be the last. Each such encounter drained something from him, not just physical strength, but a portion of the resilience that kept him fighting against the seemingly inevitable end that awaited all outlaws. Few forest fugitives survived more than a few years. Some were captured and executed, others succumbed to illness, injury, or the elements. A few managed to escape to distant parts of the country or even abroad, starting new lives under assumed identities. But most simply disappeared, their fates unknown, their bodies never found, lost to the vast, indifferent embrace of the wilderness that had been both their refuge and their prison. Thorn had already outlasted many of his kind. 3 years as an outlaw was a significant achievement, a testament to his adaptability and determination. But he harbored no illusions about his prospects. Sooner or later, his luck would run out. A moment's inattention, a betrayal by someone he trusted, a simple twist of fate. Any of these could bring his freedom to an abrupt end. These thoughts, dark as the night around him, eventually gave way to exhaustion. Thorn slept fitfully, waking at every unusual sound, his body tense and ready for flight even in repose. When dawn finally broke, grey and subdued through the continuing rain, he was already alert, assessing his situation with the clear-eyed pragmatism that survival required. His clothes were still damp, his limbs stiff with cold, but he was alive and free. The provisions from the cache had restored some of his strength, and a night without active pursuit had allowed his mind to settle into a state of watchful calm rather than panicked vigilance. It was time to move on, to rejoin his companions if they had made it to the fallback location, or to plan his next steps if they had not. The fallback site was a day's journey to the northeast, a small cave in a limestone outcropping that offered shelter and a defensible position. Thorn set out at a steady pace, more concerned with avoiding detection than with speed. The forest was quiet around him, the usual bird calls and animal movements subdued by the continuing rain. This worked to his advantage, making it easier to detect any human presence that might indicate foresters or other threats. As he walked, Thorn's mind turned to his companions. Had they escaped yesterday's sweep, or had some been captured? Will was experienced enough to evade most pursuers, and Edwin was young and swift. Elaine knew the forest's hiding places better than anyone, but old Tom, with his failing health and limited mobility, would have been vulnerable if the foresters had come upon their camp. The thought of the old man swinging from a gallows made Thorn's jaw clench with anger and grief. By midday, the rain had finally begun to slacken, allowing shafts of weak sunlight to penetrate the forest canopy. Thorn paused to rest briefly, drinking from a clear stream and eating a small portion of his remaining provisions. He was in unfamiliar territory now, having been forced well off his usual paths by yesterday's pursuit. The landscape was similar enough, the same mix of oak, elm and beech that dominated Sherwood Forest, but the specific landmarks he relied upon for navigation were absent. Still, he was confident in his general direction. The moss on the north side of the trees, the position of the sun when visible, and the gradual rise of the land toward the limestone ridge where the cave was located all guided his path. By nightfall, he should reach the fallback location, assuming no further complications arose. It was mid-afternoon when Thorn first sensed he was being watched. There was no concrete evidence, no sound or sight that definitively indicated another presence. Just the prickling awareness that comes from years of living in constant danger. He continued walking as if unaware, but his hand drifted to the knife at his belt, and his eyes scanned the surrounding forest with increased intensity. The attack, when it came, was swift and nearly silent. A figure launched itself from behind a large oak, barreling into Thorn with enough force to send both of them tumbling to the forest floor. Thorn's knife was out in an instant, but his attacker had already rolled away, coming up in a crouch several feet distant. To Thorn's shock, he recognized the face beneath the hood. "Edwin!" he gasped, lowering his knife. "I nearly gutted you, boy." The young man's face, usually open and expressive, was tight with tension. "Had to be sure it was you, and not a forester in disguise." he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're everywhere, Thorn. They surrounded our camp yesterday, just after you left." Thorn felt his blood run cold. "The others?" Edwin's expression told him everything before the words came. "Will and Elaine got away. I saw them make it to the trees. But old Tom," his voice faltered. "He couldn't move fast enough. They took him." Thorn closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the blow. Old Tom captured. It was the outcome he had feared, yet hearing it confirmed still struck him like a physical pain. "Are you certain he was taken alive?" Edwin nodded. "I circled back when I could. Saw them binding his hands. They were heading toward Nottingham." This was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. Old Tom would face trial and execution, but there might be time to act before the sentence was carried out. Medieval justice moved slowly, especially for common criminals rather than notorious outlaws. The sheriff would likely hold Tom in the castle dungeons until the next scheduled hanging day, which typically occurred monthly in larger towns. "Have you been to the fallback location?" Thorn asked, sheathing his knife and picking up the small pack he had dropped during the attack. "Aye. Will and Elaine are there. Will sent me to watch the paths, see if you or any others from our band made it out." Thorn nodded. "Lead on then. We have much to discuss." The two men moved through the forest with the caution of hunted animals, using every trick they had learned to avoid leaving signs of their passage. Edwin led the way, occasionally pointing out subtle markers that Thorn might have missed: a bent twig tied with a strand of wool, a particular arrangement of stones that looked natural to the untrained eye, but was a signal to those who knew what to look for. As they traveled, Edwin filled Thorn in on what had happened after his departure the previous day. The foresters had approached from multiple directions, clearly acting on information rather than conducting a routine patrol. Someone had betrayed them. Perhaps a villager who had spotted one of them near the forest edge, or even another outlaw, hoping to earn a pardon by turning in fellow fugitives. The attack had come suddenly, with little warning. Will had been returning from his scouting when he spotted the foresters and managed to race back to camp just ahead of them, giving Elaine and old Tom a few precious moments to flee. But old Tom, his joints stiffened by damp and age, had barely made it to the edge of the clearing before the foresters were upon them. "Will wanted to fight," Edwin said, his voice low as they climbed the increasingly rocky slope toward the cave. "He had his bow strung and an arrow nocked. But there were at least 10 of them, Thorn. It would have been suicide, and Tom knew it. He shouted for us to run, said he'd slow them down." Thorn could picture it clearly. The old man standing his ground, buying time for his younger, faster companions to escape. It was a noble act, but one that now doomed Tom to the hangman's noose, unless they could find a way to save him. The sun was setting by the time they reached the limestone outcropping where the cave was hidden. It was not visible from below, the entrance concealed behind a tumble of boulders and scrubby bushes that had taken root in the thin soil. Edwin made a soft hooting sound as they approached, an owl call that served as their recognition signal. After a moment, the call was returned from within the cave. Will appeared at the entrance, bow in hand, his face gaunt with exhaustion and worry. He nodded tersely to Thorn, then stepped aside to let the two men enter. The cave was small but dry, its ceiling high enough to stand upright near the entrance, though it lowered toward the back. A tiny fire burned in a stone-lined pit near the mouth of the cave, carefully positioned so that its light would not be visible from below. Elaine sat beside it, stirring something in a small pot. "You made it," she said, looking up as Thorn entered. The relief in her voice was palpable. "We feared the worst when you didn't return." "Nearly didn't," Thorn replied, setting down his pack and moving closer to the welcome warmth of the fire. "Ran into foresters to the northwest. Had to abandon the deer I'd killed and take the long way around." "Edwin told you about Tom?" Will asked, resuming his seat by the fire after checking that no one had followed them to the cave. Thorn nodded grimly. "We need to find out where they're holding him and when the hanging is scheduled." Will and Elaine exchanged a look that Thorn couldn't quite interpret. "You're not suggesting we try to rescue him?" Will asked, his tone making it clear what he thought of such an idea. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting," Thorne replied, accepting a bowl of thin stew from Elaine with a nod of thanks. "We can't abandon him to the gallows." Will shook his head. "It's too dangerous. Nottingham Castle is well guarded. The dungeons are beneath the keep, with only one entrance that's watched day and night. It would be throwing our lives away for nothing. So we let him hang?" Thorne's voice rose slightly, his exhaustion and grief making him less cautious than usual. "After all he's done for us?" "He made his choice," Will said, though there was sorrow rather than callousness in his tone. "He knew the risks, same as all of us. Tom wouldn't want us to die trying to save him." Thorne couldn't argue with the logic, but neither could he accept it. Old Tom had been like a father to him these past years, teaching him forest lore, sharing stories of his long life, offering wisdom and kindness when the hardships of outlaw existence threatened to overwhelm him. The thought of the old man dying alone, branded a criminal, was unbearable. "There might be another way," Elaine said softly, breaking the tense silence that had fallen. "A way that doesn't involve storming the castle." All eyes turned to her. Elaine rarely spoke about her past, but they knew she had once been married to a castle steward before being widowed and later accused of witchcraft. Her knowledge of castle operations might offer insights that the others, with their peasant or military backgrounds, lacked. "Hangings are public affairs," she continued. "They bring the prisoners from the dungeons through the town to the gallows in the market square. The route is always the same, and the escort is usually small, just 2 or 3 guards for common criminals. The streets would be crowded with spectators," Edwin added, catching her meaning. "Easy to get close without arousing suspicion." Will frowned, but Thorne could see he was considering the possibility. "Even if we could get close enough, we'd still have to overcome armed guards in broad daylight, then escape through a town where every gate and postern would be watched." "Not necessarily," Thorne said, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. "What if we created a distraction? Something to draw the guards' attention long enough for one of us to cut Tom's bonds and slip away in the confusion." The discussion continued long into the night, the 4 outlaws weighing options, identifying risks, and gradually shaping a plan that, while still dangerous, offered at least a slim chance of success. By the time they finally settled down to sleep, they had agreed on a course of action. Tomorrow, Edwin, the least recognizable of their group, would venture to the edge of Nottingham town to gather information about Tom's whereabouts and the timing of the next hanging day. Thorne's sleep was troubled that night, filled with dreams of gallows and falling bodies, of old Tom's weathered face contorted in the final agony of strangulation. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cool air of the cave. Rather than trying to return to sleep, he moved quietly past his still slumbering companions to sit at the cave entrance, watching as the first grey light of day gradually illuminated the forest below. The rain had finally stopped, and a light mist rose from the damp earth, giving the woodland an ethereal quality. It was beautiful in its way, this wild place that had become his home and refuge. Despite the hardships and dangers, Thorne had come to love the forest, to appreciate its rhythms and moods, to find comfort in its unchanging presence in a world where human affairs were marked by cruelty and caprice. But on this morning, even the tranquil beauty of dawn in Sherwood could not ease the heaviness in his heart. Old Tom was facing death, and their plan to save him was fraught with risk. If they failed, it could mean the end, not just for Tom, but for all of them. Yet the alternative, doing nothing, allowing their friend to die without even attempting to save him, was unthinkable. Behind him, Thorne heard movement as his companions began to stir. Soon, they would set their plan in motion, sending Edwin to town while the rest of them prepared for what might be their most dangerous undertaking yet. But first, there would be breakfast, a simple meal of the remaining stew and hard bread, and the routine tasks that structured their days even in crisis. checking weapons, repairing clothing, discussing the ever-present concerns of survival in the wild. These mundane activities took on a poignant quality now, shadowed by the knowledge that they might be among the last such moments this band would share together. Whether through death, capture, or the forced scattering that would follow a failed rescue attempt, their small community might soon be irrevocably altered. It was a sobering thought, one that added weight to every word and gesture as they prepared for the day ahead. Edwin departed shortly after breakfast, dressed in the rough clothes of a peasant rather than the patched leather and homespun that marked most outlaws. He carried a small bundle of herbs that Elaine had gathered, enough to justify his presence near town as a seller of simples, but not so much as to attract undue attention. His youth and relatively short time as an outlaw meant his face was not widely known to the authorities, making him the safest choice for this reconnaissance mission. With Edwin gone, the others turned to preparations for the rescue attempt. Will checked and rechecked their limited weapons. 2 bows with perhaps 20 arrows between them, 3 knives of varying quality, and a single short sword that Edwin had brought with him when he fled his father's house. Not an arsenal that would strike fear into the hearts of the sheriff's men, but they would have surprise on their side, and desperation often lent strength to outnumbered arms. Elaine sorted through her store of herbs, setting aside those that might prove useful in the coming confrontation. Plants that could cause smoke or temporary blindness when thrown into a fire, others that might help treat wounds if any of them were injured during the attempt. Her knowledge, so often dismissed as witchcraft by ignorant villagers, had saved their lives more than once, and might do so again in the days ahead. Thorn, for his part, spent the morning scouting the area around their cave, ensuring that no foresters or other threats had followed them to this refuge. He moved with practiced stealth through the forest, his senses alert for any sign of human presence. The woods seemed empty of all but their usual inhabitants, birds, squirrels, and the occasional deer, but Thorn knew better than to trust appearances. The sheriff's men were growing more cunning in their pursuit of outlaws, learning woodland skills that had once been the exclusive province of foresters and fugitives. When he returned to the cave at midday, satisfied that their immediate surroundings were secure, Thorn found Will and Elaine engaged in a low-voiced but intense conversation that ceased abruptly at his approach. He raised an eyebrow in question, but Will merely shook his head, indicating that it was nothing of importance. Thorn was not convinced, but chose not to press the issue. There was tension enough without adding to it unnecessarily. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness as they waited for Edwin's return. Each sound from the forest below, a snapping twig, a rustling of leaves, drew their attention, only to prove to be a woodland creature or the wind. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, concern grew that something had happened to their young companion. Had he been recognized and captured? Had he encountered trouble on the road? Or was his absence simply due to the difficulty of obtaining the information they sought? It was nearly dusk when the lookout signal, 3 short owl hoots, sounded from below. Moments later, Edwin appeared, climbing the steep path with evident weariness, but no sign of injury. His face, however, bore an expression that immediately told Thorn their situation had grown more complicated. "They're hanging him tomorrow," Edwin said without preamble as he entered the cave. "Dawn execution, not the usual midday, and not in the town square. They're doing it at the castle gates." Will cursed softly, the change in routine undermining key elements of their rescue plan. "Why the change?" Edwin dropped his pack and accepted a water skin from Elaine before answering. "Sheriff's ordered it. Word is, he's making an example of this batch. Caught a whole group of poachers along with old Tom, 8 men total. They're hanging them all at first light, then leaving the bodies displayed at the gates as a warning." The news hit Thorn like a physical blow. 8 men meant more guards, more witnesses, more complications, and an execution at the castle gates rather than the town square meant less cover, fewer escape routes, and a significantly reduced chance of success. "Did you see the castle?" Thorn asked, pushing aside his dismay to focus on practical matters. How many guards? What's the approach like? Edwin nodded, taking a long drink before responding. I got as close as I dared. The main gate faces east toward the town. There's a small courtyard just inside where they've built the gallows, visible from outside, but still within the castle walls. Guards on the gate, on the walls, and presumably inside as well. No way to approach unseen from the town side. What about the forest side? Will asked. The castle backs onto Sherwood, doesn't it? Aye, but the walls are higher there with no gate, Edwin replied. They're not fools. They know the threat comes from the forest. Silence fell as they absorbed this information, each mentally revising their assessment of the situation. The plan they had begun to form, to create a distraction in the crowded market square during a public execution, was no longer viable. They would need a new approach, one that accounted for the changed circumstances and significantly higher risks. Could we still create a distraction? Elaine suggested. Not in the square, but near enough to the castle to draw guards away from the gates. Will shook his head. They won't leave the execution detail undermanned, not for a minor disturbance. And anything serious enough to draw significant numbers would bring the town militia as well as the castle guards down on us. What about inside the castle? Thorn asked, a desperate idea forming. If we can't free him during the execution, could we get to him before he ever leaves the dungeons? The others looked at him with varying degrees of disbelief. Break into Nottingham Castle? Will's tone made his opinion of the suggestion clear. Might as well try to storm the Tower of London. Not storm, Thorn clarified. Infiltrate. Elaine, you said your husband was a castle steward. What can you tell us about how such places operate? Are there deliveries, servants coming and going, ways that someone might enter without being immediately challenged? Elaine considered the question, her brow furrowed in concentration, as she recalled details of a life she had left behind years ago. Castles are not as sealed as they appear, she said slowly. They're small villages unto themselves, with constant movement of people and goods. Bakers bringing bread, brewers delivering ale, merchants with supplies for the kitchens and workshops, servants who live in the town reporting for their duties, messengers arriving and departing. So disguise is possible, Thorn pressed, sensing a potential avenue of approach. Possible, yes, but risky, Elaine cautioned. The guards know the regular servants and suppliers. A new face would be questioned, especially in these tense times with outlaws being actively hunted. But not impossible, Thorn insisted. If we had a convincing reason to be there, a role that would be expected. Edwin suddenly straightened, his expression changing as an idea struck him. The priest, he said, condemned men are allowed to confess their sins before execution. A priest would be admitted to the dungeons without question. Will looked skeptical. And where do we find a priest willing to help outlaws rescue a condemned man? We don't, Thorn said, catching Edwin's meaning. One of us poses as a priest. The audacity of the suggestion momentarily silenced the group. Impersonating a priest was not merely dangerous, but sacrilegious, a sin that could damn a soul as surely as murder or blasphemy in the eyes of medieval Christianity. Yet it might offer the one chance to reach old Tom before he was led to the gallows. I'll do it, Thorn said into the silence. I know the prayers, the rituals. My father wanted me to enter the church before I became a baker's apprentice instead. I studied with the village priest for 2 years as a boy. Will shook his head, but there was a new thoughtfulness in his expression rather than outright rejection. Even if you could convince the guards you're a priest, how would you get Tom out? The dungeons have one entrance, guarded at all times. I don't know yet, Thorn admitted, but getting to him is the first step. Once I'm inside, I might find opportunities we can't anticipate from here. The discussion continued well into the night. Objections raised and addressed, alternatives proposed and discarded, risks weighed against the certainty of Tom's death if they did nothing. By the time exhaustion finally overcame them, they had settled on a desperate plan, perhaps more accurately described as the outline of a plan, with many details still to be determined. Thorn would pose as a traveling priest, come to offer final confession to the condemned men. Will and Edwin would position themselves near the castle, but out of sight, ready to assist in the escape if Thorn somehow managed to get old Tom out of the dungeons. Elaine would remain at the cave, preparing for their return, or for the possibility that they might need to flee separately if things went wrong. The chances of success were slim at best, and all of them knew it. But the alternative, abandoning old Tom to his fate without even attempting a rescue, was unacceptable, at least to Thorn. If the others harbored doubts, they kept them to themselves, unwilling to undermine what little hope remained. Morning came too soon. Grey light filtering into the cave to find the outlaws already awake and making final preparations. Thorn dressed in the closest approximation of clerical garb they could manage. A dark woolen cloak with a hood deep enough to shadow his face, a rope belt, and a crude wooden cross Elaine had fashioned during the night. His knife was hidden beneath the cloak, his outlaw's garments replaced with the plainest of their clothing to maintain the disguise. Will drew Thorn aside as the others made their own preparations, his weathered face grave. "You understand, this is likely a one-way journey," he said quietly, pitching his voice too low for the others to hear. "Even if by some miracle you reach Tom, getting him out of that castle—" "I understand," Thorn replied simply. Will studied him for a moment, then nodded once, a gesture of respect between men who had faced death together many times before. "If you don't return by nightfall, we'll assume the worst and move on. No heroic rescue attempts, no foolish risks. That's the agreement." "That's the agreement," Thorn confirmed, though they both knew that plans rarely survived contact with reality and that none of them might live to see another sunset. The parting was brief and subdued, marked by terse nods rather than emotional farewells. Such was the way of outlaws who lived with the constant knowledge that any parting might be final. Elaine pressed a small pouch of herbs into Thorn's hand. "For courage," she whispered, and Edwin awkwardly clasped his shoulder, unable to find words, but communicating volumes through the gesture. Then they were moving through the misty forest. 3 men on a desperate mission, the 4th remaining behind to safeguard their refuge and prepare for whatever outcome the day might bring. They traveled in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, as they made their way toward Nottingham Castle and the fate that awaited them there. As the castle came into view, rising above the surrounding forest like a stone sentinel, they paused for a final consultation. The massive structure, with its high walls and imposing keep, seemed an impregnable fortress from this vantage point, its very solidity a rebuke to their desperate plan. "Remember," Will said, his voice barely above a whisper despite the distance that still separated them from the nearest guards. "You approach from the town side, as if you've come from the abbey. We'll be watching from the edge of the forest. If by some miracle you get Tom out, head west along the castle wall, then south into the trees. We'll cover your retreat if needed." Thorn nodded, committing the instructions to memory, though he had little expectation of reaching that stage of the plan. "If I'm not out by midday, assume I've been captured or killed. Don't wait for me." Will and Edwin melted back into the forest, moving toward their observation positions, while Thorn continued alone toward the town. He circled wide around the castle, approaching from the east as a legitimate traveler would, his hood pulled forward to shadow his face, his posture adjusted to mimic the humble bearing of a man of God rather than the wary stance of a fugitive. The town was just waking as he entered its outskirts, smoke rising from chimneys, as households lit morning fires, a few early risers already moving about their business in the narrow streets. Thorn kept his eyes downcast, avoiding direct contact that might lead to conversation or recognition. A few people nodded respectfully as he passed, taking him for what his disguise suggested, a traveling priest about some errand of mercy or church business. The castle loomed larger as he approached, its grey walls stark against the morning sky. The gallows were visible now, erected just inside the main gate as Edwin had described, a grim wooden structure with 8 nooses hanging ready, awaiting the necks of the condemned men. A small crowd had already begun to gather outside the gate, the execution serving as a form of grim entertainment in a town where diversions were few. Thorn steeled himself as he approached the guards at the gate, forcing his features into an expression of solemn purpose rather than the fear and desperate determination that churned within him. This was the first and potentially most dangerous test of his disguise. If the guards were suspicious, if they asked questions he couldn't answer convincingly, the plan would end before it had truly begun. "Halt!" one of the guards commanded as Thorn reached the gate. "State your business." Thorn bowed his head slightly, affecting the mild deference of a cleric addressing secular authority. "I am Brother Thomas, from the Abbey at Rufford," he said, choosing a location distant enough that his identity would be difficult to verify, but close enough to justify his presence. "I have come to offer confession to the condemned men before their execution." The guard frowned, clearly not expecting this development. "We've had no word of a priest coming." "The abbot received word of the executions only yesterday," Thorn improvised smoothly. "It is our duty to provide spiritual comfort to those about to meet their Maker, regardless of their crimes. Surely you would not deny these men the chance to cleanse their souls before death?" The appeal to religious duty had the desired effect. The guard's frown deepened, but he stepped aside, gesturing to a second guard to escort Thorn. "Take him to Captain Robert. Let him decide." Thorn nodded his thanks, careful to maintain his clerical demeanor as he followed the second guard through the gate and into the castle courtyard. The gallows loomed to his right, a grim reminder of what awaited if his deception was discovered. Soldiers and servants moved about the courtyard, preparing for the day's grim business, paying little attention to yet another visitor to the castle. The guard led him not to the dungeons, but to a small chamber off the main courtyard, where a middle-aged man in the livery of the sheriff's captain sat at a table reviewing documents. Captain Robert looked up as they entered, his expression questioning. "A priest from Rufford Abbey, sir," the guard explained. "Says he's come to hear the condemned men's confessions." The captain studied Thorn with shrewd eyes, taking in his attire and bearing. "We weren't expecting a priest," he said, his tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of suspicion. "The Lord's work often comes unexpectedly, Captain," Thorn replied, meeting the man's gaze with the confident assurance of one who believes in the righteousness of his cause. "These men will stand before God's judgment by day's end. Would you have them do so with unshriven souls?" Captain Robert considered this, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but be quick about it. The executions are scheduled for first light, and dawn is nearly upon us." Thorn bowed slightly, relief washing through him, though he was careful not to let it show on his face. "I shall require privacy with each man for the sanctity of confession. A corner of the dungeon where others cannot overhear will suffice." The captain nodded to the guard. "Take him down, then. Stay within sight, but give him space to hear the confessions. And search him first. Even priests have been known to smuggle weapons or tools to prisoners." This was a complication Thorn had anticipated, but hoped to avoid. The knife hidden beneath his cloak would immediately reveal him as an imposter, but refusing the search would be equally damning. He stood passive as the guard patted him down, discovering the knife almost immediately. "What's this, then?" the guard demanded, drawing the weapon from its hiding place. "A simple eating knife," Thorn replied calmly, though his heart raced. "The roads are dangerous, and a traveler must be prepared to defend himself. I meant no deception." The captain frowned, taking the knife and examining it. It was indeed a simple tool rather than a fighting weapon, which lent credence to Thorn's explanation. After a moment's consideration, he set it aside on the table. "You can retrieve it when you leave, Brother Thomas. We'll keep it safe until then." Thorn nodded his acceptance, hiding his dismay. The knife had been a central element of his vague rescue plan. Without it, freeing old Tom would be even more difficult than he had anticipated. But there was no choice now but to proceed and hope that opportunity presented itself once he was in the dungeons. The guard led him through the courtyard and down a narrow stone staircase that descended beneath the keep. The air grew damp and cold as they descended, the walls slick with moisture, the only light provided by smoky torches set in iron brackets at irregular intervals. The smell hit him next, the unmistakable stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and the dank mustiness of underground spaces with poor ventilation. The dungeon itself was a large, roughly rectangular chamber divided into cells by iron bars. Some cells held multiple prisoners, while others contained solitary figures huddled on straw pallets. The guard led Thorn to the far end of the chamber, where a separate cell held the men scheduled for execution. There were 8 of them, as Edwin had reported, most sitting in dejected silence, a few engaged in quiet conversation. Thorn scanned the cell, locating old Tom almost immediately. The old man sat apart from the others, his back against the damp stone wall, his eyes closed as if in sleep or prayer. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by captivity, his weathered face gaunt and pale in the dim torchlight. "These are the ones for the gallows," the guard said, gesturing toward the cell. "I'll be over there watching but not listening as the captain ordered." He pointed to a position some 20 feet away, near enough to respond to any trouble, but far enough to provide the illusion of privacy for confession. Thorn nodded his understanding, then approached the cell. "I am Brother Thomas," he announced, pitching his voice to carry to the prisoners, but not to the guard. "I have come to hear your confessions before you face God's judgment." The prisoners stirred, some looking up with interest, others remaining slumped in despair. Old Tom's eyes opened, fixing on Thorn with no sign of recognition, the dim light and Thorn's hood concealing his identity from the old man as effectively as from the guards. "I will speak with each of you individually," Thorn continued, maintaining his clerical persona. "Who wishes to be first?" One of the prisoners, a middle-aged man with a farmer's weathered complexion, rose and approached the bars. "I'll go first, Father. I've sins enough to confess, and little time left to do it." Thorn nodded, gesturing for the man to kneel at the bars. As he bent his own head as if listening to confession, he murmured instructions for the man to speak of imaginary sins, loudly enough for the guard to hear occasional words, but not the full conversation. The puzzled prisoner complied, embarking on a disjointed narrative about stolen chickens and unpaid tithes, while Thorn pretended to listen attentively. In this manner, Thorn worked his way through several prisoners, each confession providing cover as he gradually moved closer to old Tom's position in the cell. When he finally reached the old man, Thorn bent close to the bars, pulling his hood back just enough for Tom to see his face clearly. The old man's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in alarm. "You fool," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "Rescuing you," Thorn replied, equally quiet, "though I'm still working out the details of how." Old Tom shook his head, a mixture of exasperation and reluctant admiration in his rheumy eyes. "You always were the reckless one. But this is madness, boy. There's no way out of here, not for me. Save yourself while you can." "I didn't come this far to leave without you," Thorn insisted. "Is there anything you know about this place? Any weakness in their security? Any opportunity we might exploit?" The old man was silent for a moment, thinking. "The guard changes at mid-morning," he finally said. "There's a brief period when there's confusion, men coming and going, but what good does that do us? I'm still behind these bars, and you're still outnumbered 20-1. Thorn glanced toward the cell door, noting the heavy iron lock that secured it. Without his knife, he had no tool to pick the lock, and no key that might open it. The situation seemed increasingly hopeless, yet he refused to abandon his purpose. "When they come for you," he said, formulating a desperate plan as he spoke, "they'll have to open the cell. That's our opportunity. I'll create a distraction, something that draws attention away from the cell. When it happens, be ready to move." Old Tom looked skeptical. "And then what? Even if we somehow get out of the cell, we're still deep in the castle, surrounded by armed men. One problem at a time, Thorn replied, a grim determination settling over him. First the cell, then the dungeon, then the castle. Will and Edwin are waiting outside to help with the escape. Before old Tom could respond, a commotion at the dungeon entrance drew their attention. The captain of the guard had arrived, accompanied by several soldiers. "It's time," he announced, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "Bring the prisoners out." Thorn's heart sank. The executions were happening earlier than he had anticipated, leaving no time for the guard change old Tom had mentioned. Whatever he was going to do, it had to happen now, with far fewer resources than he had hoped for. As the guards moved toward the cell, Thorn made a swift decision. He stepped away from old Tom, moving toward the center of the dungeon, where a brazier of coals provided meager warmth to the dank space. Reaching into his cloak, he withdrew the small pouch of herbs Elaine had given him. "For courage," she had said. But perhaps they could serve another purpose as well. The guards were unlocking the cell now, chains ready to bind the prisoners for their final journey to the gallows. Thorn waited until they were fully engaged in this task, then casually dropped the entire pouch into the brazier. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The herbs, whatever combination Elaine had prepared, erupted in a cloud of thick, acrid smoke that rapidly filled the confined space of the dungeon. Guards and prisoners alike began coughing and choking, visibility reduced to almost nothing in seconds. In the confusion, Thorn moved swiftly toward the cell, guided more by memory than sight in the smoky darkness. He found old Tom by touch, gripping the old man's arm and pulling him toward what he hoped was the direction of the stairs. "Stop them!" the captain's voice shouted through the smoke, followed by the sounds of armored men stumbling and colliding in the blinding haze. Thorn and old Tom reached the stairs, the old man moving with surprising speed, given his age and the conditions of his captivity. They ascended as quickly as they could, the smoke thinning as they climbed, but still providing some cover for their escape. They emerged into the courtyard to find it in the early stages of alertness. Guards responding to shouts from below, but not yet fully aware of what was happening. Thorn kept his hood up, maintaining the pretense of the priest for as long as possible, guiding old Tom toward the main gate with a hand on his arm as if assisting a frail penitent. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the gate when a cry went up behind them. "The prisoners are escaping! Stop them!" Abandoning all pretense now, Thorn broke into a run, pulling old Tom along with him. The old man stumbled, his weakened legs struggling to match the pace, but determination lent him strength he had not known he possessed. The guards at the gate were turning toward them now, alerted by the shouts from behind. Escape through the main entrance was no longer possible. Thorn veered sharply to the right, heading for the western wall of the castle as Will had instructed. If they could reach the forest edge, they might still have a chance, slim though it was. An arrow whistled past Thorn's ear, followed by another that struck the ground at his feet. The castle's archers had joined the pursuit, taking aim from the walls above. It was only a matter of time before one found its mark. They reached the base of the western wall, a sheer stone face some 30 feet high, with no obvious means of scaling it. Thorn looked frantically left and right, seeking any path of escape as the sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them. "There!" old Tom gasped, pointing to a narrow service postern partially hidden behind a stack of lumber. It was likely locked, but it represented their only hope. They reached the small door just as the first of their pursuers rounded the corner of the keep. Shouting in triumph at the sight of the cornered fugitives, Thorn tugged desperately at the iron handle, expecting resistance. But to his shock, the door swung open. Someone had left it unlocked, perhaps a servant stepping out for a moment, perhaps a guard taking an unauthorized break. Thorn pushed old Tom through the opening, following quickly behind and pulling the door shut. There was no way to lock it from this side, but it might buy them precious seconds of confusion as their pursuers searched for where they had gone. They found themselves on a narrow track that descended steeply toward the forest edge. The ground was muddy from recent rains, making the footing treacherous, but they hurried downward as best they could, the sounds of alarm and pursuit echoing from the castle walls behind them. The tree line was tantalizingly close now, perhaps 100 yards away across an open meadow. If they could reach the forest, they stood a chance of losing their pursuers in the dense undergrowth they knew so well. But the open ground offered no cover, and old Tom was flagging, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his steps increasingly unsteady. "Leave me!" the old man wheezed, stumbling to a halt. "I'll only slow you down. Save yourself, boy." "Not a chance," Thorn replied, supporting the old man with an arm around his waist. "We go together or not at all." A shout from behind indicated their pursuers had discovered the postern and were now on their trail. Arrows began to fall around them again as they struggled across the meadow, each step seeming to take an eternity. Thorn was so focused on reaching the tree line that he almost missed the movement at the forest edge. A figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, bow drawn and aimed toward them. For a moment, Thorn thought it was another castle guard, positioned to cut off their escape. Then the arrow flew, not at them, but past them, toward their pursuers. Will stepped fully into view now, loosing arrow after arrow to provide covering fire as Thorn and old Tom made their final desperate dash for the forest. Behind them, shouts of pain and anger indicated that at least some of Will's arrows had found their marks. They reached the tree line at last, Will grabbing old Tom's other arm as they plunged into the welcome darkness of the forest. Edwin appeared a moment later, leading them deeper into the woods, along a route he had clearly scouted in advance, away from the paths the castle guards would likely follow in pursuit. "I thought we agreed no heroic rescue attempts," Thorn gasped as they ran, his lungs burning with exertion. Will's grim smile was visible even in the forest gloom. "I lied," he replied simply. They ran for what seemed like hours, though it was likely no more than 20 minutes, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the castle before old Tom's strength gave out completely. The old man collapsed against a tree trunk, his face ashen, his breathing labored. "I can't go on," he managed between gasps. "Leave me. I'll only slow you down." "We're not leaving you," Thorn said firmly, though he shared the old man's concern. Their pursuit would be relentless now. Not just foresters hunting poachers, but soldiers pursuing escaped prisoners and attackers of the king's men. They needed to move quickly and continuously if they hoped to evade capture, something old Tom was clearly in no condition to do. Will assessed the situation with the pragmatic eye of a former soldier. "We need to split up," he decided. "They'll be looking for 4 men traveling together. Separate, we're just common travelers or woodsmen, less likely to attract attention. I'll take old Tom," Thorn volunteered immediately. "I know a place, an old hermit cell near the northern edge of the forest. It's well hidden, and there's a spring nearby. We can shelter there until he's strong enough to travel further." Will nodded. "Edwin and I will head east, create a false trail for them to follow. We'll rendezvous at the limestone cave in a fortnight, assuming we all make it that long." There was no time for lengthy farewells. A brief clasping of hands, a few words of encouragement, and they were separating, Will and Edwin heading east, while Thorn supported old Tom on a northward path that would eventually lead to the hermit's cell he had discovered during his early days in the forest. Progress was painfully slow. Old Tom could manage only a few hundred yards before needing to rest, his strength sapped by captivity and the desperate escape. Thorn feared they were leaving a trail even a novice tracker could follow, but there was no alternative. They could only continue as best they could and hope that Will and Edwin's diversion would draw the main pursuit away from them. By nightfall, they had covered perhaps 3 miles, a pitiful distance under normal circumstances, but a significant achievement given old Tom's condition. They made camp in a small hollow, concealed by thick undergrowth, too exhausted to continue and unwilling to risk injury by traveling in darkness. "You shouldn't have come for me," old Tom said, as they huddled beneath a crude shelter of branches Thorn had hastily constructed. "It was foolish. You risked everything." "You would have done the same for any of us?" Thorn replied simply. The old man was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. I suppose I would have, though I'd have had a better plan than walking straight into the castle disguised as a priest. Thorn smiled despite their dire circumstances. It worked, didn't it? By pure luck, old Tom retorted, but there was affection in his voice. You always did have more courage than sense, boy. And they slept fitfully that night, taking turns to keep watch, though in truth neither was capable of remaining alert for long in their exhausted state. Morning found them stiff and hungry, but alive and still free, small mercies in a situation that remained desperately precarious. They continued their journey north, making slightly better progress as old Tom found reserves of strength he had not known he possessed. By midday, they reached a small stream where they drank deeply and rested while Thorn fashioned a crude fishing spear from a straight branch. His efforts yielded 2 small trout, which they ate raw, unwilling to risk a fire that might attract attention. The hermit's cell, when they finally reached it late in the afternoon, proved to be little more than a shallow cave with a partially collapsed stone wall across its entrance. But it was dry and well concealed, the entrance hidden by a thicket of brambles that had grown up since its last occupant departed or died. A small spring bubbled from the rock nearby, providing fresh water, and the surrounding forest offered berries, nuts, and the possibility of game for those who knew how to find them. Thorn helped old Tom settle inside, using his cloak and what dry leaves he could gather to create a somewhat comfortable bed. The old man was asleep almost immediately, his body finally succumbing to the extreme exertion of the past 2 days. Thorn watched him for a moment, relief and concern mingling, as he observed the shallow rise and fall of the old man's chest. They had escaped, against all odds, but their future remained uncertain at best. The next days fell into a pattern of cautious survival. Thorn ventured out at dawn and dusk to gather food, always alert for signs of pursuit or other danger. During the daylight hours, he remained close to the cell, tending to old Tom, whose strength returned slowly but steadily. They spoke little, conserving energy and avoiding the deeper questions that lurked beneath the surface of their daily existence. Questions about what they would do next, how long they could survive as fugitives, whether there could ever be an end to their outlaw existence that didn't involve a hangman's noose. A week passed, then another. The appointed day for the rendezvous at the limestone cave approached, bringing with it the need for decisions. Old Tom was recovering, able to walk short distances without assistance, but still far from his former self. The journey to the cave would take at least 2 days for a healthy man. For old Tom, it might require 4 or more, with each day on the move, increasing the risk of discovery. "We should separate," old Tom suggested, as they discussed their options one evening. "You go to the meeting place, see if Will and Edwin made it. I'll stay here until you return." Thorn shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving you alone. Either we both go, or neither of us does." The old man sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of Thorn's jaw. "You're loyal to a fault, boy. It'll get you killed one day. We're all going to die one day," Thorn replied with a shrug. "The question is how we live until then." In the end, they decided to remain at the hermit's cell for another week, giving old Tom more time to regain his strength before attempting the journey to the rendezvous point. It was a risky delay. Will and Edwin might conclude they hadn't survived and move on, but the alternative seemed even more dangerous. It was during this period of waiting that Thorn began to notice changes in the forest around them. There were fewer birds singing in the mornings, the undergrowth seemed trampled in places it should not have been, and twice he found unfamiliar footprints near the spring. Someone was searching the area, methodically and carefully, but with unmistakable purpose. He said nothing to old Tom, not wanting to worry the old man unnecessarily, but he redoubled his own vigilance, venturing farther afield to gather food so as not to deplete the immediate area and create a pattern that might be noticed. He set small alarms, arrangements of twigs that would snap noisily if disturbed, around the approaches to their hiding place, and he slept even more lightly than before, waking at the slightest unusual sound. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost a relief after days of mounting tension. Thorn was returning from checking a snare he had set the previous day, a small rabbit slung over his shoulder, when he sensed rather than saw movement behind him. He turned slowly, unsurprised to find a man standing on the path, a drawn bow pointed steadily at his chest. The man was not dressed as a castle guard or a forester, but in the simple clothing of a woodsman or hunter. But the bow he held was of fine quality, and the steady way he maintained his aim spoke of military training rather than casual experience. "Thomas Miller," the man said, using Thorn's original name rather than his outlaw moniker. "You've led us a merry chase these past weeks." Thorn remained still, assessing his options and finding them severely limited. The bowman was too far away to rush before an arrow would find its mark, and there was no cover nearby that might offer protection. Flight was equally impossible. An arrow in the back would fell him before he had gone 10 paces. "Who are you?" he asked, playing for time while his mind raced for a solution. "My name doesn't matter," the man replied. "What matters is that Sir Geoffrey has offered £20 for your capture, dead or alive, a fortune for a common man. A bounty hunter, then. The worst kind of pursuer, motivated by personal gain rather than duty, often more ruthless than regular law officers, and typically working alone or in small groups that could move swiftly and quietly through the forest. £20 for a baker's son who didn't kill a falcon," Thorn said bitterly. "Sir Geoffrey's pride must be more wounded than I thought." The bounty hunter shrugged, the motion so slight it didn't affect his aim. "The price went up after you broke into the castle and freed a condemned prisoner. That was bold, I'll give you that. Foolish, but bold." "Are you alone?" Thorn asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Bounty hunters rarely shared rewards if they could avoid it. "Alone enough to take you in," the man replied. "Now, we can do this the easy way. You come quietly, and I deliver you to Nottingham with all your limbs intact. Or the hard way, I put an arrow through your leg and you still go to Nottingham just in more pain. Your choice." Thorn weighed his limited options. Fighting seemed suicidal. Running was equally futile. Surrender meant certain death at the end of a rope. None of the choices were good, but at least if he surrendered, he might find an opportunity for escape on the journey to Nottingham. It was a slim hope, but better than no hope at all. He was about to drop his knife and yield when a voice spoke from the trees to the bounty hunter's left. "I'd reconsider those options if I were you." The bounty hunter started, his aim wavering momentarily as his head turned toward the sound. It was all the opening Thorn needed. He dropped to the ground, rolling toward the minimal cover of a fallen log as the bounty hunter's attention was divided. An arrow flew from the trees, striking the bounty hunter in the shoulder of his bow arm. He cried out in pain, the bow falling from nerveless fingers as he clutched at the wound. A second arrow followed, this one striking him in the thigh, bringing him to his knees. Will stepped from the trees, another arrow nocked and ready. "Next one goes through your throat if you move," he said calmly. Edwin emerged from the opposite side of the clearing, his own bow drawn and aimed at the wounded bounty hunter. The young nobleman's son looked leaner and harder than when Thorn had last seen him, with a new scar running along his jawline that hadn't been there before. "Took you long enough," Thorn said, rising from his position behind the log. "I was about to surrender just to end the conversation." Will's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "We've been tracking this one for 3 days. Figured he'd lead us to you eventually." The bounty hunter glared at them, his hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. "You're all dead men. Sir Geoffrey has 100 men searching the forest. There's nowhere in England you can hide." "We're not planning to hide in England," Will replied, exchanging a significant look with Thorn. "We're leaving, all of us, tonight." This was news to Thorn. "Leaving? To go where?" "France," Edwin answered. "I have family connections in Normandy, distant cousins who owe my father no loyalty. They'll shelter us, at least for a time. Will has arranged passage on a merchant ship sailing from Hull in 3 days." Thorne's mind raced, absorbing this unexpected development. Leaving England had never been part of his considerations. The forest had been his world for so long that he had ceased to think beyond its boundaries. But the idea held undeniable appeal. A fresh start, free from the constant threat of capture and execution, perhaps even the possibility of a normal life eventually. "What about him?" Thorne asked, nodding toward the wounded bounty hunter. Will's expression hardened. "He doesn't make it to Normandy." The cold certainty in Will's voice told Thorne all he needed to know about what the former soldier intended. It was the logical solution. The bounty hunter would otherwise report their plans, and the ports would be watched. But Thorne had never killed in cold blood, and the prospect troubled him deeply. "There's another way," he said slowly. "We bind him, leave him here. By the time he frees himself or someone finds him, we'll be long gone." Will shook his head. "Too risky. He's seen our faces, heard our plans." "So we changed the plans," Thorne insisted. "Tell him we're going to Scotland or Wales. By the time he reports it and they realize the deception, we'll still be safely away." Will and Edwin exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Will nodded reluctantly. "Your mercy may get us all killed, but have it your way. We'll bind him and leave him with a false trail to follow." They used the bounty hunter's own rope to secure him to a tree, gagging him with a strip of cloth torn from his cloak. The arrows were left in place. Removing them might cause him to bleed to death, which would defeat the purpose of sparing his life in the first place. They made a show of discussing a fictional plan to escape to Scotland, mentioning specific routes and a non-existent contact in Edinburgh who would help them cross the border. When they were satisfied that the deception was convincing, they gathered what few possessions the bounty hunter had been carrying, his bow, a knife, a small pouch of coins, and prepared to depart. The man glared at them with undisguised hatred, but there was also a glimmer of relief in his eyes at being left alive, however uncomfortable his circumstances. "Old Tom is waiting at a hermit's cell north of here," Thorne told Will and Edwin as they moved away from the bound bounty hunter. "He's recovering, but travel will be difficult for him." "We accounted for that," Edwin said. "We have a cart hidden near the forest edge. Nothing fancy, but it will carry Tom and move faster than he could walk." Thorne was impressed by the thoroughness of their planning. "How did you arrange all this?" "The ship, the cart, Elaine," Will answered simply. "She had connections we didn't know about. A brother who trades along the coast, former patients who owed her favors. She's already on her way to Hull with most of our supplies, traveling as a respectable widow, returning to family in France. We'll meet her at the harbor." The pieces were falling into place, a plan more comprehensive and promising than anything Thorne could have devised on his own. For the first time in years, he felt something like hope stirring within him, not just the desperate determination to survive another day, but a genuine belief that there might be a future beyond the shadow of the gallows. They retrieved old Tom from the hermit's cell, the old man expressing gruff pleasure at seeing Will and Edwin alive and well. His eyes lit up at the news of their impending departure from England, though he tried to mask his excitement with his usual crusty demeanor. "France, is it?" he said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Never thought I'd see the day when English soil became too hot for these old bones. But I suppose a change of air might do me good." The journey to the coast was not without its challenges. Old Tom, despite his brave words, struggled with the rigors of travel, and the cart Edwin had procured, while functional, was hardly comfortable over the rough roads and paths they were forced to take to avoid populated areas. They traveled mostly by night, resting during daylight hours in secluded copses or abandoned barns, always alert for signs of pursuit or the casual curiosity of local peasants that might lead to their discovery. Yet there was a different quality to their vigilance now, an undercurrent of anticipation rather than dread, a sense that they were moving toward something rather than merely running away. Even the discomforts of the journey seemed more bearable when viewed as temporary hardships on the path to a new beginning rather than the endless struggle of their forest existence. Hull appeared on the horizon at sunset of the third day, its harbour crowded with vessels of various sizes, from small fishing boats to larger merchant ships that plied the trade routes to the continent. Following Edwin's directions, they made their way to a nondescript inn near the waterfront where Elaine awaited them. The reunion was joyful, but subdued, tempered by the knowledge that they were still fugitives on English soil, still at risk until the ship sailed with the morning tide. Elaine had secured passage for all of them, listed on the ship's manifest as a widow, traveling with her brothers and elderly father, a simple family story unlikely to arouse suspicion in a port accustomed to all manner of travelers. That night, as they gathered in the small room Elaine had rented, sharing a modest meal and speaking in hushed tones of their plans and hopes for their new life across the channel, Thorn found himself oddly contemplative. He stood apart from the others for a moment, gazing out the narrow window at the stars visible above the harbour, the same stars that had guided him through countless nights in Sherwood Forest. Old Tom joined him at the window, moving with the careful deliberation of one whose body betrays him, but whose spirit remains strong. "Having second thoughts, boy?" the old man asked, his voice low enough that the others, engaged in their own conversation across the room, could not hear. Thorn shook his head slowly. "Not second thoughts, just remembering. I never thought I'd leave England. Despite everything, it's still home." "Home is where you make it," old Tom replied, his weathered hand coming to rest on Thorn's shoulder. "I was born a serf, bound to the same manor for 60 years, never allowed to travel more than a day's journey from the place of my birth. Now here I am, about to cross the sea to a land I've only heard stories about. If an old man like me can start anew, a young buck like you should have no trouble." Thorn smiled at the old man's characterization. "I'm hardly young anymore. 3 years in the Greenwood ages a man." "3 years?" old Tom snorted. "That's nothing. You've decades ahead of you, God willing. Time enough to build something, to find some measure of peace. That's all any of us can ask for in this life." Dawn brought clear skies and a favorable wind, as if the elements themselves approved of their departure. They boarded the ship without incident. The captain, a gruff but not unkindly man who had been well paid for his discretion, showing them to the small space between decks that would be their quarters for the crossing. As the ship weighed anchor and began to move away from the dock, Thorn stood at the rail, watching the shore of England recede. The land that had been both his home and his prison was becoming a diminishing line on the horizon, soon to be lost to sight, though never to memory. Will joined him at the rail, his face unreadable as he too gazed at the retreating coastline. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing old Tom's question from the previous night. Thorn considered this, feeling the ship's motion beneath his feet, the salt spray on his face, the wind in his hair, all new sensations for a man who had spent his life on solid ground, in forests and villages far from the sea. Ahead lay uncertainty, the challenges of a new land, a new language, new customs to learn and adapt to. But also possibility, the chance to be something other than a fugitive, to reclaim some part of the humanity that had been slowly eroded by years of outlaw existence. "No regrets," he answered finally, turning away from England to face the open sea and whatever lay beyond. Only hopes. The ship moved steadily into the channel, carrying its passengers toward a future none of them could fully envision, but all were eager to discover. For Thorn, as for his companions, the long nightmare of life as a medieval outlaw was ending. What would replace it remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, the horizon held promise rather than threat, opportunity rather than constraint. As England disappeared from view, swallowed by distance and the morning mist, Thorn offered a silent farewell to the land of his birth, to the forest that had sheltered him, even to Sir Geoffrey, and the twisted sense of justice that had set him on this path. Then he turned his face fully toward the future, toward France, and whatever new story awaited him there, no longer Thorn the outlaw, but Thomas Miller once again, a man reborn, ready to begin anew in a world of unexpected possibilities. The crossing to France was not the smooth journey they had hoped for. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and the gentle roll of the ship intensified into a pronounced pitch and heave that sent old Tom and Edwin retreating below decks, their faces pale with seasickness. Thorn and Will remained topside longer, fascinated despite their discomfort by the vastness of the sea and the workings of the ship. The sailors moving with practiced efficiency as they adjusted sails and secured cargo against the worsening weather. When the rain began to fall in earnest, driven horizontally by a strengthening wind, they too sought shelter in the cramped space between decks that served as their quarters. The small compartment, barely 8 feet square with a low ceiling that forced even Elaine to stoop, became their world for the next 36 hours, as the ship battled its way across the channel through the autumn storm. The darkness was almost complete, broken only by the feeble light of a small oil lamp that swung wildly with the ship's motion, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the rough wooden walls. The air was thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, vomit, and the pervasive damp that seemed to penetrate everything. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by particularly violent motions of the ship or the sounds of the crew shouting above as they fought to keep the vessel on course. "If I'd known the sea was this cruel," old Tom muttered during a brief lull in the storm, "I might have taken my chances with the hangman after all." Despite his jest, there was real suffering in the old man's face. The rigors of the crossing were taking a heavy toll on his already weakened body. Elaine tended to him as best she could in the confined space, using what herbs she had managed to bring with her to brew a tea that settled his stomach somewhat, though nothing could fully counteract the effects of the relentless motion. By dawn of the second day, the storm had begun to abate, and by midday the clouds had parted enough to allow watery sunlight to illuminate the choppy grey-green surface of the channel. The captain, making a rare appearance among his common passengers, informed them that they had been blown somewhat off course, but would make landfall by evening, not at their intended destination of Calais, but at a smaller port some 30 miles down the coast. "It makes little difference," Will observed after the captain had departed. "We have no specific destination in Normandy beyond Edwin's distant relations, and they're a week's journey inland, regardless of where we land." Edwin nodded agreement, though he looked decidedly unwell, his usual youthful vigor dimmed by the ordeal of the crossing. "My mother's cousin married a minor Norman lord. I've never met them, but family is family. They'll at least give us shelter while we decide our next steps." As promised, land appeared on the horizon late that afternoon, a thin, dark line that gradually resolved into the distinct shapes of cliffs and beaches. The small port nestled in a natural harbour formed by a river mouth, its stone buildings clustered around a modest quay where several fishing boats were already tied up. Disembarkation was a chaotic affair, with passengers and cargo being transferred to small boats for the final journey to shore, the larger ship being unable to approach closer due to the shallow harbour. Thorn found himself gripping the gunwale of the rowboat with white-knuckled intensity, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were in this transitional moment, neither fully at sea nor safely ashore, dependent on the strong arms of the sailors who rowed them toward the stone steps of the quay. Their first steps on French soil were anticlimactic, the same firm earth beneath their feet as they had known in England, the same salt breeze in their faces, the same gulls wheeling overhead. Yet there was an immediate sense of difference as well, subtle but unmistakable. The architecture of the buildings, the cut of the fishermen's clothing, the cadence of the language being spoken around them, all familiar enough to be comprehensible, but foreign enough to create a constant awareness of displacement. "What now?" Elaine asked quietly as they stood on the quay, their meager possessions gathered at their feet, the ship that had brought them already preparing to depart on the evening tide. Will took charge, as he often did in practical matters. First, lodging for the night, then transport inland, a cart or wagon if we can afford it, or horses if they're cheaper. We should be away from the coast by tomorrow. Ports have too many eyes, too many officials asking questions. They found accommodation at a small inn near the harbour, the sort of establishment that catered to sailors and travellers of modest means. The innkeeper, a corpulent man with a florid face and a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow, spoke no English, but Edwin's rudimentary Norman French, a legacy of his noble education, was sufficient to secure them 2 small rooms and a hot meal. The food was their first pleasant surprise in France, a rich fish stew flavoured with herbs unfamiliar to Thorne's English palate, accompanied by dark bread and a sharp local cheese. After the privations of outlaw life and the miseries of the crossing, it seemed a feast fit for nobility. Even old Tom, still weak from seasickness, managed several spoonfuls, colour gradually returning to his pallid cheeks as the warm food and the even warmer room began to revive him. They spoke little during the meal, too exhausted and overwhelmed by the day's experiences for conversation. When they finally retired to their rooms, Elaine in one, the men sharing the other, sleep came swiftly and deeply, the solid ground beneath them a luxury after the constant motion of the ship. Morning brought renewed energy and the practical challenges of their new situation. Their combined resources, pooled together on the rough wooden table of their room, were meagre. A few English coins of dubious value in France, a silver brooch that had been Elaine's mother's, and the items they had taken from the bounty hunter, including his bow and knife, which might be sold if necessary. "It's enough to get us to Normandy if we're careful," Will assessed, dividing the coins into small piles representing anticipated expenses, but not much beyond that. "We'll need to find work once we reach Edwin's relations, assuming they're willing to shelter us at all." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all. If Edwin's Norman connections proved unwelcoming, their situation would become dire indeed. Strangers in a foreign land, without resources, unable to speak the language, and carrying the indefinable but unmistakable air of those who have lived outside the law. They departed the port town by mid-morning, having purchased passage on a merchant's wagon heading inland. The conveyance was rudimentary, an open cart with hard wooden benches and no springs to soften the impact of the rutted roads. But it was faster than walking and easier on old Tom's failing strength than horseback would have been. The French countryside unfolded around them as they travelled, at once familiar and foreign. The same patchwork of fields and forests that characterized rural England, but with subtle differences in the construction of the peasant cottages they passed, the style of the field boundaries, the very rhythm of agricultural life. Thorne found himself studying everything with the heightened awareness of a man whose survival had long depended on noticing details others might overlook. The language barrier proved to be their most immediate challenge. When the wagon stopped at midday at a small village tavern, the process of ordering food and drink became a complex pantomime, with Edwin's limited French supplemented by gestures and expressions of varying effectiveness. The locals regarded them with curiosity rather than hostility, accurately identifying them as English travellers, but showing no particular interest in their circumstances or reasons for being in France. This indifference was a blessing, Thorne realized. In England, strangers were objects of immediate suspicion, particularly in rural areas where everyone knew everyone else and outsiders were rare. Here, perhaps due to the greater movement of people between regions or simply a different cultural attitude, their presence aroused only mild interest, quickly satisfied and forgotten. They spent that night in the loft of a barn, whose owner had been persuaded by a few coins to provide shelter, continuing their journey the next morning with a different carter heading further inland. This pattern repeated for several days. Gradual progress toward their destination, nights spent in whatever accommodations they could arrange, meals consisting primarily of bread and cheese, supplemented occasionally by whatever local fare they could afford. Old Tom's health became an increasing concern as they traveled. The initial recovery he had shown after the sea crossing proved short-lived. The constant motion of the cart over rough roads exhausted him, and a persistent cough developed that kept him awake at night and sapped what little strength he had regained. Elaine treated him as best she could with the limited herbs and remedies available to her, but it was clear to all of them that the old man was failing. "We need to find a place to stop, to let him rest properly," Elaine said quietly to Thorn and Will as they walked a short distance from where old Tom and Edwin were resting during a midday halt. "Another week of this travel will kill him as surely as the hangman's rope would have." Will nodded grimly. "We're still at least 3 days from where Edwin believes his relations are located, possibly more if the roads worsen. But you're right. Tom can't continue like this." The decision was made to seek more permanent lodging in the next sizable settlement they encountered, a market town straddling a small river that served as a regional trading centre. Here, Edwin's French proved adequate to secure them rooms above a tanner's workshop, not the most pleasant location due to the smell that permeated everything, but affordable and, crucially, available for an extended stay. Old Tom was installed in the smallest but warmest of the rooms, a narrow space barely large enough for a straw mattress and a 3-legged stool, but with the advantage of being directly above the tanner's fire pit, which provided consistent heat through the rough wooden floor. Elaine took charge of his care, establishing a routine of herbal teas and poultices that seemed to ease his breathing somewhat, though the cough persisted. The others turned their attention to the practical matter of survival. Their funds were dwindling rapidly, and while the cost of living in this provincial French town was less than it would have been in a comparable English settlement, they still needed income to sustain themselves. Will, with his military background and physical strength, found occasional work as a labourer, loading and unloading merchants' wagons or helping local farmers with tasks requiring strong arms. Edwin, despite his noble upbringing, or perhaps because of it, proved surprisingly adept at gambling, winning modest sums at dice in the local tavern, though Thorn worried about the attention such activities might eventually attract. For his own part, Thorn struggled to find a useful role in their new circumstances. His skills as a baker might have served him well, but without knowledge of the language or local connections, no bakery would hire him. His woodland abilities, hunting, tracking, foraging, were less applicable in this semi-urban environment. Eventually he found occasional employment as a porter and messenger, tasks that required little linguistic ability but took advantage of his endurance and reliability. Weeks passed in this manner, their existence precarious but sustainable. They sent Edwin ahead alone to locate his Norman relations, reasoning that a single traveller would attract less attention, and that Edwin's education and linguistic abilities gave him the best chance of successfully navigating the social complexities of approaching distant family members for assistance. In his absence, the others settled into a routine of work, care for old Tom, and cautious exploration of their new environment. Thorn gradually picked up rudimentary French phrases, enough to conduct basic transactions and respond to simple questions. Will maintained a vigilant wariness, always alert for signs that their true identities or backgrounds had been discovered. Elaine, in addition to tending old Tom, began to establish connections with local women, particularly those known for their knowledge of herbs and healing, exchanging techniques and slowly building a small repository of dried plants and remedies. Old Tom's condition stabilized but did not improve. The persistent cough and weakness continued, and while he no longer seemed in immediate danger of death, neither did he show signs of regaining the strength necessary for further travel. He bore his confinement with surprising grace, his natural storytelling abilities undiminished by his physical decline. In the evenings, when the others returned from their various endeavors, he would regale them with tales from his long life, stories of the manor where he had been born, of harvests and famines, of lords both cruel and kind, of the small rebellions and minor victories that had punctuated his existence as a serf. "You should write these down," Elaine suggested one evening after a particularly vivid account of a traveling fair that had visited Old Tom's village in his youth. Future generations would value such memories. The old man snorted dismissively. Who would read the ramblings of an old serf? Besides, I never learned my letters. The church controls such knowledge, and they've little interest in educating those born to labor rather than to pray or rule. Thorne, who had received rudimentary instruction in reading and writing as part of his preparation for a potential church career, before becoming a baker's apprentice instead, found himself considering Elaine's suggestion more seriously than Old Tom had. There was wisdom in the old man's stories, a perspective on medieval life rarely recorded by the chroniclers and scribes who concerned themselves primarily with the doings of kings and bishops. Perhaps there was value in preserving these tales, if only for their small band of exiles. He began to devote some of his limited free time to the project, using scraps of parchment purchased with carefully hoarded coins and a quill and ink borrowed from a local scribe in exchange for carrying messages. Old Tom was bemused by the enterprise at first, but gradually warmed to it, taking evident pleasure in seeing his words captured and preserved, even if he could not read them himself. This peaceful interlude, tenuous though it was, came to an abrupt end with Edwin's return, nearly a month after his departure. He arrived at their lodgings late one evening, haggard from travel, and bearing news that extinguished the fragile hope they had been nurturing. "My relations want nothing to do with us," he announced without preamble, collapsing onto a bench in their shared living space. "They fear association with English fugitives would compromise their standing with their Norman lord. They offered me a lone sanctuary as a blood relation, but refused to extend the same to the rest of you." The news was a blow, though not entirely unexpected. The ties of distant family relationship were thin indeed when weighed against the practical risks of harboring fugitives from English justice. "Did you accept their offer?" Will asked, his tone neutral, without accusation. Edwin shook his head firmly. "I would not abandon you after all we've been through together. Besides, they made it clear that even my welcome was contingent on complete disavowal of my previous life and companions. I would have been little more than a hostage to their goodwill, dependent entirely on their charity and subject to their every demand." There was a moment of silence as they absorbed this development and its implications for their future. The precarious stability they had established in the market town had always been temporary, a breathing space rather than a permanent solution. Now they needed to formulate a new plan, a longer-term strategy for survival in a land where they had no roots, no connections, and increasingly limited resources. "We could try to reach Paris," Edwin suggested tentatively. "In a city that size, we could disappear completely. No one would question our origins or notice a few more English immigrants among the thousands who live there." Will frowned, considering the suggestion. "Cities have their own dangers. More officials, more documentation required, more attention paid to strangers. And the cost of living would be higher, while our skills might be worth less in a place where specialized trades are well established and protected by guilds." "What about further south?" Elaine proposed. "I've heard the climate is milder, the land more fertile. Perhaps a small village where they need workers for vineyards or olive groves." The discussion continued long into the night, possibilities raised and examined, rejected or set aside for further consideration. By dawn, they had reached no firm conclusion beyond the recognition that their current situation could not continue indefinitely. Their funds were nearly exhausted. The goodwill of their landlord was wearing thin, as Old Tom's persistent cough disturbed other tenants, and the longer they remained in one place, the greater the risk that word of their presence might somehow reach English ears. The decision was eventually forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control. A week after Edwin's return, the market town received an unusual visitor, an English merchant accompanied by a small retinue of guards and servants. His presence was noteworthy enough to be the subject of tavern gossip, which Will overheard during one of his infrequent visits to the establishment. "He's asking questions," Will reported grimly upon his return to their lodgings about recent English arrivals, particularly a group including an elderly man and a woman. He claims to be seeking relatives, but the description is too close to us for comfort. The implication was clear. Somehow, word of their presence had reached England, perhaps through the merchant ship that had transported them across the channel, perhaps through some other channel. The exact mechanism mattered less than the fact that they were being sought, and likely not for any benevolent purpose. "We leave tonight," Thorne decided, the others nodding in agreement. "Take only what we can carry easily, nothing that would mark us as a group fleeing in haste." Old Tom, who had been listening silently from his pallet in the corner, now spoke up. "You should go without me," he said, his voice weaker than it had been, but his gaze steady. "I'll only slow you down, as I did in England, and I'm tired of running, tired of watching over my shoulder. I've lived more years than most men of my station, seen more of the world than I ever expected to. Perhaps it's time to stop running." "No," Thorne said firmly, echoing his response from their flight through Sherwood Forest. "We stay together. We've come this far as one, and we'll continue that way." The old man smiled faintly, a mixture of exasperation and affection in his rheumy eyes. "Still stubborn, I see. Very well, but you'll need to help me. I don't think these old legs will carry me far tonight." They departed as planned, slipping out of the market town under cover of darkness, taking a little used path that led southward along the river rather than the main road where they might be observed. Will carried old Tom on his back for much of the journey, the old man's weight distressingly light against his broad shoulders. Elaine had packed what medicinal herbs and supplies she could into a single bundle, while Thorne and Edwin carried their few remaining possessions and the small store of food they had managed to assemble on short notice. Their progress was slow but steady, guided by stars partially obscured by drifting clouds, the river a silver ribbon beside them in the darkness. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 5 miles, not an impressive distance under normal circumstances, but significant given their encumbrances and the need to move quietly and avoid the main thoroughfares. They made camp in a small copse of trees, far enough from the path to avoid casual discovery, but close enough to the river to have access to fresh water. Old Tom was exhausted by the journey. His breathing labored, his cough more pronounced than it had been in days. Elaine tended to him with quiet efficiency, brewing a tea from her dwindling supply of herbs, but the worry in her eyes was evident to all. "How long can we continue like this?" Edwin asked quietly, as they gathered branches for a small, sheltered fire that would produce minimal smoke. "Old Tom can't withstand many more nights like the last, and we have no destination, no plan beyond fleeing from immediate danger." It was the question they had all been avoiding, the fundamental uncertainty that underlay their every decision since leaving England. They were reacting rather than acting, responding to threats rather than moving toward a defined goal. Such a strategy, while sometimes necessary in the short term, was unsustainable over time. "We need more than just a destination," Thorne said slowly, articulating thoughts that had been forming in his mind since their hasty departure. "We need a purpose, a reason for being here beyond simply avoiding English justice, something that gives meaning to this exile." Will looked up from the fire he was carefully nursing into life. "What kind of purpose did you have in mind?" "We're fugitives in a foreign land, with few skills that are valued here and no connections to ease our way." "Perhaps that's not entirely true," Thorne replied, an idea taking shape as he spoke. "Elaine's knowledge of herbs and healing has already gained her some respect among the local women. Edwin's education and facility with languages are rare assets. Your military experience, Will, would be valued by any lord seeking to train his men-at-arms. And I—" He paused, considering his own contributions. "I was trained as a baker before all this began. People need bread in France as surely as they do in England." There was a moment of silence as they considered this reframing of their situation, not as desperate fugitives, but as individuals with skills and knowledge that might be of value in their new home. "You're suggesting we stop running and start settling," Elaine said, rejoining the conversation after ensuring old Tom was as comfortable as circumstances allowed. "Find a place where we can use these abilities, become part of a community, rather than remaining perpetually apart from it." Thorne nodded. "Exactly. We've been thinking of ourselves as English exiles, temporary visitors, waiting for a chance to return or move on. But what if we became French instead? Not in birth, obviously, but in outlook and allegiance. What if we built new lives here, not just hiding from our past, but embracing a different future?" The concept was radical, particularly in an age where identity was so strongly tied to place of birth and where foreigners were typically viewed with suspicion at best. Yet there was an undeniable appeal to the idea of finally putting down roots after years of precarious existence, of building something stable and meaningful rather than merely surviving from day to day. "It won't be easy," Will cautioned, ever the pragmatist. "We'd need to learn the language properly, understand the local customs, find a community willing to accept strangers, and we'd still need to be cautious about English merchants or officials who might recognize us." "Nothing worthwhile is ever easy." Old Tom's voice came unexpectedly from where he lay wrapped in blankets near the small fire. "But the boy's right. You can't spend your whole lives running. Sooner or later you have to stand and build something, or what's the point of having escaped the gallows at all?" The discussion continued throughout the day, becoming more practical and detailed as initial skepticism gave way to cautious planning. By evening, a consensus had emerged. They would continue south, but with purpose rather than panic driving their journey. They would seek not just safety, but opportunity, a place where their varied skills might find appreciation and where the tightly knit bond they had formed through shared hardship might become the foundation for a new kind of family. This shift in perspective, subtle but profound, altered the very nature of their travels in the days that followed. They still moved cautiously, still avoided main roads and large settlements where English visitors might be present, but there was a new alertness to their observations of the countryside they passed through, noting not just potential dangers, but also indicators of prosperity, signs of communities that might be open to newcomers with useful abilities. Old Tom's condition remained a constant concern, limiting their daily progress and necessitating frequent stops for rest. Yet even this constraint became part of their evolving strategy. Elaine began to use these halts not just for the old man's care, but as opportunities to interact with local herb gatherers and healers they encountered, building a network of cautious acquaintances and gradually improving her command of the language through these professional exchanges. They had been traveling in this manner for nearly 2 weeks, making their way steadily southward through increasingly varied terrain when they came upon a sight that stopped them in their tracks. In a small valley between gentle hills, a cluster of stone buildings stood partially complete around the blackened ruins of what had clearly been a substantial structure, perhaps a manor house or small monastery. People moved among the ruins and the new construction, their activities suggesting a community in the process of rebuilding after some disaster. Fire, most likely, Will assessed as they observed from a distance. See how the damage is concentrated in what was probably the main building, while the outbuildings seem relatively intact. A lightning strike, perhaps, or a cooking fire that got out of control. Whatever the cause, the scene presented an unexpected opportunity. A community engaged in reconstruction would likely have need of additional labor and skills, particularly if they had lost members in the disaster that had damaged their settlement. It was worth investigating, they agreed, though with the usual caution that had become second nature to them. Thorne and Edwin approached openly, leaving Will, Elaine, and old Tom concealed in a small grove of trees within sight of the settlement. If there was danger, better that only 2 of them were exposed to it, and Edwin's improving French would be essential for initial communication. Their reception was cautious, but not hostile. The settlement, they learned, had indeed suffered a devastating fire several months earlier, sparked by lightning during a summer storm. The blaze had claimed the manor house of the local lord and several of the surrounding buildings, along with the lives of the lord himself and a number of his household. The community was now under the nominal authority of the lord's widow, a young woman named Isabel, who had taken the unprecedented step of overseeing the reconstruction herself, rather than remarrying immediately or turning control over to a male relative. She was, the villagers told them with evident pride, mixed with lingering shock at the unconventional arrangement, determined to rebuild her husband's legacy before considering any suitors. This unusual situation, while doubtless the subject of gossip and disapproval in more traditional circles, created an opening for outsiders like themselves. A widowed noblewoman managing an estate without the customary male authority would be less bound by convention in her hiring practices, potentially more willing to judge people by their usefulness rather than their origins. Edwin, whose noble background gave him insight into the social dynamics at play, suggested they present themselves not as fugitives or even as English exiles, but simply as skilled workers seeking employment, drawn by word of the reconstruction efforts. Their foreignness might even be an advantage in this context. They would have no local allegiances or entanglements that could complicate their service to the widow Isabel. The approach proved successful beyond their cautious hopes. After initial interviews conducted through an elderly steward who had survived the fire, they were granted a collective audience with the lady herself, a slender, dark-haired woman, perhaps 10 years younger than Thorne, with a composed demeanor that did not quite conceal the strain of her responsibilities. She received them in what had once been a stable but now served as a temporary hall while the manor house was rebuilt. The setting was humble compared to the usual trappings of nobility, but there was a dignity in her bearing and in the simple arrangement of the space that commanded respect nonetheless. Edwin, acting as spokesman due to his superior French and familiarity with aristocratic protocol, presented their case with a carefully calibrated mixture of deference and confidence. They were, he explained, travelers from England seeking a place to settle and apply their various skills. The precise circumstances of their departure from their homeland were left tactfully unmentioned, though he did not attempt to hide their accents or foreign origins. Lady Isabel listened with evident interest as Edwin enumerated their abilities. Elaine's knowledge of herbs and healing, Will's military experience, Thorne's training as a baker, and his own education and linguistic skills. When he mentioned old Tom, describing him as an elderly family member whose health was failing, but whose knowledge of agriculture and animal husbandry remained sharp, her expression softened slightly. "My husband valued practical wisdom," she said, her French clear but unhurried, as if to ensure they understood. "He often said that an old farmer knows more about the land than a dozen young knights. Your grandfather, is he?" "A dear friend who has become as family to us," Edwin replied, the careful phrasing acknowledging the unusual nature of their relationship without inviting further questions. Lady Isabel nodded, seeming to appreciate the honesty of the response. "Bring him to the settlement. We have need of healers and bakers, certainly, and my remaining men-at-arms could benefit from experienced leadership. As for you," she addressed Edwin directly, "your education is evident in your speech. Perhaps you might serve as a tutor to my son, who is now 7 and in need of instruction beyond what our village priest can provide." The offer was generous and comprehensive, providing roles for each of them that matched their abilities while keeping them together as a group. There was, Thorne suspected, an element of political calculation in the lady's decision. Surrounding herself with capable foreigners who owed their position entirely to her favor was a way of building a household staff loyal to her personally, rather than to local factions or her late husband's family. But such pragmatism did not diminish the opportunity being presented. They accepted with appropriate gratitude, Edwin negotiating modest but fair terms for their service, lodging, food, and small stipends commensurate with their positions. By sunset, They had retrieved Old Tom and their few possessions from the grove where they had waited, and were being shown to their new accommodations, a small outbuilding that had survived the fire, its 4 rooms providing them with more private space than they had enjoyed since leaving England. That night, as they settled into their new quarters, there was a cautious sense of accomplishment among them. They had found not just temporary shelter, but potentially a long-term home, a place where their skills were valued, and where they might, in time, build new identities disconnected from their outlaw past. "It won't be easy," Will cautioned as they shared a simple meal provided by the manor kitchens. "We'll be watched closely at first, our every action scrutinized. One mistake, one slip that reveals more of our background than we wish known, could undo everything." "True enough," Thorne acknowledged, "but for the first time since we fled into Sherwood, we have a chance to be judged by what we do, rather than by what we've done. That's worth the risk, I think." Old Tom, who had been unusually quiet since their arrival, nodded slowly from his place by the small hearth. "It's a strange thing," he said, his voice thoughtful beneath the persistent wheeze of his breathing. "I spent 60 years bound to one manor, dreaming of freedom, only to find it briefly in outlawry, and now, perhaps, in service to another manor entirely. Life takes unexpected turns." "Is that regret I hear, old man?" Elaine asked gently, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders. Tom shook his head. "Not regret, no. More like appreciation for the irony. And gratitude, I suppose. Not many men of my station get to see the world change around them as I have, or to choose their final resting place rather than having it chosen for them." There was a somber note in his words that silenced them all for a moment. Old Tom's health had stabilized during their journey south, but had not improved. The persistent cough, the labored breathing, the gradual weakening, all indicated a decline that might be slowed but not reversed. He would not see another winter, they all knew, though none had spoken it aloud. "Well," Edwin said finally, breaking the heavy silence, "if this is to be your resting place, Tom, we'll make sure it's one worthy of you. A place where your stories are remembered, your wisdom valued. A proper home, not a fugitive's camp or a condemned man's cell." The old man smiled, the firelight softening the deep lines of his face. "I'd like that," he said simply. "A home for all of us in the end." That would be a fitting conclusion to our journey, and so began their integration into the life of the manor and village, a process that unfolded gradually over the weeks that followed. Each found their place in the reconstructing community, applying their skills, while carefully maintaining the fiction of their background as simple English travelers rather than fugitives from royal justice. Thorne, installed in the partially rebuilt bakehouse, quickly established himself as a master of his craft. The French techniques differed somewhat from those he had learned in England, but the fundamental principles were the same, and he adapted readily, earning respect from the village women who brought their dough to be baked in the communal oven under his supervision. Will took charge of training the depleted contingent of men-at-arms, his military experience evident in the disciplined exercises he instituted and the practical improvements he made to their equipment and routines. Lady Isabel, initially skeptical of allowing an Englishman such authority, was won over by the obvious results of his methods and by his straightforward, unassuming manner. Elaine found her niche in the still room of the manor, working alongside the local wise woman who had been overwhelmed with responsibilities since the fire claimed several other healers. Her knowledge of herbs, supplemented by what she had learned during their journey through France, proved invaluable, and her gentle manner with patients transcended the language barrier that still sometimes complicated her interactions. Edwin, perhaps the most transformed of them all, assumed the role of tutor to Lady Isabel's young son with unexpected dedication. His noble education, originally intended to prepare him for a life of privilege he had forfeited through a moment's violent impulse, now served a constructive purpose, shaping the mind of a child who would one day inherit responsibility for the entire community. Old Tom, though increasingly confined to their quarters by his failing strength, became a source of practical advice on agricultural matters, consulted by the steward and visiting farmers with a respect that amused and gratified him in equal measure. "Never thought I'd live to see a French Lord Steward listen to an English serf as if he were Solomon himself," he remarked after one such consultation about crop rotation practices. Through it all, they maintained their vigilance, always alert for signs that their true history had been discovered, or that English authorities might have traced them to this remote corner of France. But as months passed without incident, as the rebuilding of the manor progressed and their positions within the community became increasingly secure, the constant tension that had defined their existence for so long began, gradually, to ease. They were not fully French, would never be entirely accepted as such, but neither were they any longer merely English fugitives. They were becoming something more complex and perhaps more interesting, people of two worlds, carrying elements of both cultures while belonging completely to neither. In that ambiguous space, they found a freedom of sorts, an opportunity to define themselves by choice rather than circumstance. Old Tom did not live to see the completion of the manor house. He died peacefully in his sleep one autumn night, nearly a year after their arrival at the settlement, having declined steadily but painlessly thanks to Elaine's constant care. They buried him in the village churchyard, Lady Isabel herself attending the funeral in recognition of the esteem in which the old man had come to be held despite his short time among them. Thorn, standing by the simple grave as the priest intoned the Latin prayers for the dead, felt a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. Old Tom had escaped the hangman's noose, had died a free man with friends at his side rather than alone in a castle dungeon. It was, in many ways, a victory, though one tinged with the inevitable sadness of parting. He would have appreciated this, Will said quietly, as they walked back to their quarters after the ceremony. A proper Christian burial, prayers for his soul, respect from the community, more than most men of his station receive, even without the complications of outlawry. Thorn nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Old Tom had been the heart of their small band, the living connection to a simpler past, a source of wisdom and perspective that had guided them through their darkest moments. His absence left a void that could not be filled, a silence in their shared quarters that echoed with memories. Life continued as it must. The manor house was completed that winter, a more modest structure than its predecessor, but solid and well-crafted, a testament to the resilience of the community and the determination of its widowed lady. They moved from their outbuilding to proper quarters within the new manor, a tangible sign of their acceptance and incorporation into the household. With spring came new developments. Lady Isabel, who had resisted pressure from her late husband's family to remarry immediately after his death, began to receive suitors again, a necessary step in securing the future of her son and the estate. The politics of these interactions were complex, with each potential match bringing different alliances, resources, and complications. Edwin, whose position as tutor to the heir gave him unique insights into these machinations, found himself increasingly consulted by Lady Isabel on matters beyond his formal responsibilities. His education and his outsider's perspective made him a valuable advisor, able to assess the strengths and weaknesses of various suitors without the bias of local feuds or long-standing alliances. This evolving role brought new risks, greater visibility, more interaction with visiting nobility who might have connections to England, increased scrutiny of his background and qualifications. Yet it also represented an opportunity for all of them to establish more securely their place in this new world they had entered. "She trusts your judgment," Thorn observed one evening as they sat in the manor's small garden, enjoying the lengthening spring twilight. "That's a rare thing, for a noblewoman to value the counsel of a commoner, let alone a foreign one." Edwin smiled slightly, plucking a blade of grass and twisting it between his fingers. "I'm not sure she sees me as a commoner anymore. The lines blur here, more than they did in England, Or perhaps it's just that her unusual situation makes her more willing to look beyond conventional boundaries. There was something in his tone that caught Thorne's attention, a note of personal investment that went beyond professional pride in being valued for his abilities. "You admire her," he said, making it a statement rather than a question. Edwin was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I admire her courage," he said finally. "Her determination to rebuild what was lost, to protect her son's inheritance, to make her own decisions despite the pressures placed upon her. That takes a kind of strength few possess, regardless of rank or gender." Thorne nodded, recognizing the sincerity in his friend's words, but also the careful boundaries being maintained. Whatever Edwin might feel for Lady Isabel, and Thorne suspected it was more complex than simple admiration, he was wise enough to know that some gaps could not be bridged, even in this more fluid society they had found. The conversation shifted to other matters. The progress of Will's training program, Elaine's experiments with local medicinal plants, Thorne's efforts to introduce English baking techniques that had been well received by the village. Their lives had acquired a rhythm, a stability that would have seemed impossible during their desperate flight from England, yet beneath this apparent security, a current of uncertainty still flowed. They remained, fundamentally, people living under assumed identities, their past a secret that could resurface at any moment to destroy the present they had built. This awareness colored their interactions, influenced their decisions, kept them slightly apart from those around them, despite their integration into the community. The test of this precarious balance came, as such tests often do, unexpectedly, and from an unanticipated direction. A delegation arrived from a neighboring lord, ostensibly to discuss boundary disputes and water rights, but with an underlying agenda related to Lady Isabel's potential remarriage. Among the visitors was a clerk who had spent time in England, a sharp-eyed man with a remarkable memory for faces and names. He noticed Will first, during a demonstration of the men-at-arms training exercises arranged to impress the visitors. Something in the former soldier's bearing or commands triggered a recollection, a connection to a military campaign years earlier. The clerk made no immediate accusation but began asking casual questions of the household staff, piecing together information about the English servants who had arrived the previous year. Word of these inquiries reached Edwin through his network of connections within the manor, alerting them to the potential danger before it fully materialized. They gathered in Thorne's bakehouse, the heat and noise of the ovens providing cover for their urgent conversation. "He hasn't made any specific allegations yet," Edwin reported, his voice low despite the ambient noise. "But he's clearly suspicious. He's asked about our backgrounds, our arrival, whether we came as a group or individually. Could he know about the escape from Nottingham Castle?" Elaine asked, her hands continuing to shape dough, even as her mind focused on the threat. That news might have spread beyond English borders, especially in noble circles. Will shook his head. "Unlikely. I never served directly under this lord or his vassals, though I may have fought in the same campaign at some point. It's more likely he recognizes me vaguely, but can't place from where. The problem is that his curiosity might lead him to make inquiries when he returns home, perhaps send messages to England seeking information." The danger was clear. Even if the clerk's current suspicions were vague, his investigation could eventually connect them to their outlaw past. Once that happened, their position here would become untenable. Lady Isabel, regardless of how much she valued their service, could not afford to knowingly harbor fugitives from English justice, not when she was navigating the delicate politics of potential remarriage and securing her son's inheritance. "We could leave," Thorne suggested, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Disappear before his suspicions crystallize into certainty. Find another place, further from the border perhaps, where English influence is weaker." The proposal hung in the air between them, a return to the uncertainty and danger they had thought behind them. After a year of building new lives, of creating something stable and meaningful from the chaos of their flight, The prospect of returning to that nomadic existence was deeply disheartening. There might be another way, Edwin said slowly, his expression distant as he worked through possibilities. A way that addresses the threat without requiring us to abandon everything we've built here. The others looked at him expectantly, hope mingling with skepticism. Edwin had always been the strategist among them, the one who could envision multiple paths forward when others saw only dead ends. But this situation seemed to offer few alternatives to flight. The clerk's suspicions are based on recognition, not evidence, Edwin continued. He thinks he knows Will from somewhere, and that has made him curious about the rest of us. But what if we provide him with a plausible explanation, one that accounts for his sense of familiarity, while redirecting him from the truth? What kind of explanation? Will asked, his tone cautious but interested. A partial truth, Edwin replied. You were indeed a soldier, as your training methods make obvious. Why not acknowledge that you served in some of the same campaigns he recalls, but as a mercenary rather than as part of the English army? Many English soldiers sell their swords to continental lords after completing their service to the crown. It would explain his recognition without connecting you to any specific events in England that might lead back to our actual history. The idea had merit. By offering a plausible alternative explanation for the clerk's nagging sense of recognition, they might satisfy his curiosity without prompting deeper investigation. It was a risk, certainly. The fabricated background would need to withstand scrutiny, and they would need to ensure their stories aligned perfectly. But it offered a chance to preserve what they had built, rather than abandoning it entirely. They spent the remainder of the day refining the strategy, constructing a coherent narrative that incorporated enough truth to be convincing while carefully avoiding any details that might connect them to their outlaw past. Will would acknowledge his military background, but place his service primarily on the continent rather than in England. Thorn would present himself as a journeyman baker who had traveled to France to learn new techniques. Elaine would be a widow whose healing skills had been learned from a French-born mother. Edwin would admit his noble education, but attribute his departure from England to a desire for adventure rather than a flight from justice. The approach worked better than they had dared hope. When the clerk next engaged Will in conversation, the former soldier's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of his mercenary past and his casual mention of specific campaigns diffused much of the suspicion. The clerk, finding his general impression confirmed, but his more specific concerns addressed, seemed satisfied, particularly when the rest of their backgrounds aligned with the roles they had assumed in the manor. The delegation departed after 3 days, the boundary disputes temporarily resolved, and Lady Isabel having successfully navigated the implicit marriage negotiations without committing to anything definitive. The immediate danger passed, though it left behind a renewed awareness of their vulnerability and the fragility of the lives they had constructed. We were fortunate this time, Will observed, as they watched the delegation's departure from the manor gates. The clerk was curious, but not particularly determined. A more persistent investigator might not have been so easily satisfied. Thorn nodded, acknowledging the truth of this assessment. We should be prepared for the next time. There will always be visitors, always be connections to our past that we can't anticipate or control. Perhaps, Edwin said thoughtfully, but each passing month makes that past more distant, less relevant to who we are now. We're becoming different people here, not just in name or occupation, but in fundamental ways. The longer we remain, the more genuine our new identities become. There was wisdom in this observation, Thorn realized. They had begun their French existence as fugitives wearing disguises, playing roles that were foreign to their true selves. But over time, the boundaries between disguise and reality had blurred. Thorn the baker was no longer merely Thomas Miller in hiding. He had incorporated new techniques, adapted to local tastes, become recognized for skills he had not possessed when he fled into Sherwood Forest years earlier. The same was true for all of them. Will's leadership of the men-at-arms reflected not just his military background, but the specific challenges and conditions of this particular manor. Elaine's healing practice had evolved to incorporate French traditions and local plant knowledge. Edwin had discovered in himself an aptitude for teaching and diplomacy that had never been fully expressed in his previous life. They were, in a very real sense, becoming the people they had pretended to be, their assumed identities, acquiring depth and authenticity through lived experience. It was a strange alchemy, this transformation from pretense to reality, but perhaps it offered the most sustainable path forward, not constant vigilance and deception, but gradual, genuine integration into their new world. The years that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. Lady Isabel eventually remarried, choosing a younger son from a powerful local family, a match that brought political advantages while allowing her to maintain significant control over her son's inheritance and the management of the estate. The new lord, a scholarly man more interested in his books than in administrative details, was content to leave much of the practical running of the manor in his wife's capable hands, an arrangement that preserved the positions of her trusted English servants. Edwin's role evolved from tutor to unofficial steward, his responsibilities expanding as Lady Isabel's son grew older and began to assume some duties of his own. The young heir, now approaching adolescence, had developed a deep attachment to his English teacher, viewing him as a mentor and father figure in the absence of his own lost parent. Will, aging but still formidable, gradually delegated more of the physical training of the men-at-arms to younger subordinates while focusing on strategy and administration. His reputation as a military advisor spread beyond the boundaries of the manor, bringing occasional requests for consultation from neighboring lords, a development that both increased his standing and created new risks of recognition, though these diminished as his appearance changed with the passing years. Elaine established a comprehensive herb garden and still room that became known throughout the region, attracting both patients seeking treatment and apprentices hoping to learn her methods. Her integration into the community was perhaps the most complete of all of them, her healing work transcending barriers of language and culture, her quiet competence earning universal respect. Thorne's Bakehouse became a center of community life, a place where the production of daily bread intersected with the exchange of news and the maintenance of traditions. He had taken on apprentices, teaching a new generation the combined techniques of English and French baking that had become his personal style. In doing so, he found something of the family connection he had lost when he fled his father's business years earlier. None of them ever returned to England, though news of their homeland reached them periodically through travelers and merchants. They learned of King John's death and the accession of his young son Henry III, of the ongoing tensions between crown and barons, of changes in law and custom that might in a different world have eventually allowed for their safe return. But as the years passed, the pull of their birthplace diminished, replaced by the deeper roots they had established in this once foreign soil. They remained connected to each other, bound by the shared secret of their origins and by the experiences that had shaped their unlikely journey from outlaws to respected members of a French manor community. It was not the life any of them had envisioned when they first fled into Sherwood Forest, not the future Thomas Miller had imagined when he was unjustly accused of killing a nobleman's falcon, but it was, in its way, a life of meaning and purpose, of connections forged through adversity and maintained through choice rather than circumstance. On an autumn evening, much like the one when old Tom had passed away years earlier, Thorne stood in the small churchyard where they had buried their friend, the simple wooden cross that marked his grave, now weathered but still standing. He had come here, as he often did, to reflect on the strange path that had brought him to this place, to consider the choices and chances that had transformed a baker's son into an outlaw, and then into something else entirely, a man between worlds, belonging fully to neither, but finding a unique place within both. "I think you would have been proud, old man," he said softly to the silent grave. "We've built something here, something that might last beyond us. Not grand or notable enough for the chronicles the monks keep, but real nonetheless, a life worth the living." As he turned to leave, the setting sun cast long shadows across the churchyard, the familiar silhouette of the manor visible on the hill beyond. It was home now, in a way Sherwood Forest had never quite managed to be, despite the years he had spent within its shelter. Not because the walls were more substantial or the food more plentiful, but because here, finally, he had found not just safety, but purpose. Not just companions, but community. The life of a medieval outlaw had been one of constant peril, of hunger and cold, of isolation and fear. The life he had found on the other side of that experience, through luck and determination and the loyalty of those who had traveled the path with him, was something richer and more complete. Not without its own challenges and complexities, its moments of danger and doubt, but fundamentally a life in which he could recognize himself, not as a fugitive playing a role, but as a man who had, against all odds, found his proper place in the world. As darkness settled over the churchyard and the first stars appeared in the clear autumn sky, Thorn made his way back toward the manor, toward the warmth of the great hall where his friends would be gathering for the evening meal, toward the future that continued to unfold day by day in this distant land that had become, unexpectedly but undeniably, home.